Chapter 802. The two of them were in a stalemate for a while. In the end, Eric saw that Miranda was about to cry and almost laughed out loud. Forget it, I'll just take it as raising a kitten. With that thought in mind, Eric no longer insisted on taking back the black card. Anyway, the money this girl spent was indeed a huge sum of money for ordinary people, but for Eric, it was just the cost of a lollipop. Moreover, if this girl in front of him really had the tendency to lose control, Eric only needed to call to cancel the credit card. Miranda had been carefully peeking at Eric's expression changes. As his expression softened, the girl also realized something. She once again put on a fawning smile and said, "Eric, really, I won't spend money recklessly again." Eric's tone did not change. He did not want the girl to be too proud. He said in a flat tone, "Kelly will return to Los Angeles in the afternoon. You go back with her. You are not allowed to leave Los Angeles for the whole year." Miranda immediately found the flaw in Eric's words and said coquettishly, "Then what if Mom and Dad want me to go back to Australia for Christmas?" Okay, Eric, I will be obedient." Miranda saw that Eric's face was gloomy again and did not dare to play tricks. She turned around the desk and intimately wanted to hug Eric's neck. Eric raised his hand and pushed the girl's small waist away. He said, "Don't pester people. Go find Kelly." Eric, you are really a coward. 2. Annoying, you actually use this method to scare people. Although she realized that Eric was counting down, the little fairy did not dare to test Eric's patience anymore. She turned around and slipped out of the study. Seeing the door close, Eric shook his head and smiled. He once again picked up the few pages of credit card statements on the table. He leaned back, put his feet on the table, and slowly flipped through them. At the same time, he was thinking about how to arrange the future of this little kitten. In any case, Eric did not intend to let Miranda walk the path of the past supermodel. How tiring that would be. Since it was a cat, of course, it should lie comfortably on the master's sofa and enjoy life with its eyes closed. Due to its geographical location at the border of Eastern and Western Europe, and the support of Germany and other Western European powers, the Czech Republic could be considered the first country to develop after the upheaval in Eastern Europe. Of course, in terms of economy, it was far inferior to Germany and France. Casino Royale was mainly shot in Prague in the Czech Republic. The scenes included a car chase scene between Bond and the villain, as well as some dialogue scenes. In addition, the exterior shots of Bond's train ride to Montenegro were also shot at the Czech Mountain Railway. As for Montenegro, the Bosnia-Herzegovina war that had lasted for more than 3 years had just ended at the end of last year. The few countries there were still in chaos, so there was no possibility of filming on the spot. Because of the publicity effect of the 007 series in the country and the city where it was shot, the Czech government, which was eager to further open up, attached great importance to the shooting. When shooting the chase scene between Bond and the villain, they even blocked 2 streets for a week. While the crew was shooting in the Czech Republic, the North American summer was entering its final stage. After Men in Black 2, Game of Bravehearts 2 officially hit the 2,800 big screens in North America the following week. However, the ending was shocking. Because that week, MGM also released the second part of the Resident Evil series, Resident Evil Revelations. The first week box office of Game of Bravehearts 2, which cost $86 million, lost to Resident Evil Revelations, which was not very noticeable. This was a very embarrassing result. The first, Resident Evil, which cost $30 million, earned $60 million in box office in North America, and the global box office totaled $126 million. Moreover, this apocalyptic sci-fi movie performed even better in the video market. Within a year of the release of the video and DVD, the producers had a net profit of more than $60 million. Therefore, the production cost of Resident Evil Revelations soared to $45 million. During the production stage, MGM's plan was to recoup most of the cost from the box office. The main source of profit was the income from the video and copyright. MGM now had enough power to operate these long-term businesses. Before the 2 movies were released, although Game of Bravehearts 2 had a bad reputation, most box office analysts estimated that the first week box office would be no less than $50 million. However, the final result was that Resident Evil Revelations grossed $37 million in the first week, while Game of Bravehearts 2 grossed $22 million in the first week. The two new movies only occupied the third and fourth positions on the weekly box office rankings. In terms of word of mouth, the media's reviews were not good because of the disadvantages of the Resident Evil series. The average score was only 6.5 out of 10. However, based on the $37 million in the first week, the total box office for this sequel might reach $70 million. Including the overseas box office, it was enough to recoup all the production and distribution costs. On the other hand, Game of Bravehearts 2 failed miserably. Its box office was only $22 million in the first week, which was 50% lower than most agencies' expectations. Also, because of the confusing plot, the media only gave the film a score of 4.6 out of 10. Most of the film critics' comments were a farce with a lot of CG scenes. Under such circumstances, the failure of Game of Bravehearts 2 was already set. Firefly had only participated in the production of $50 million, and with the income from the box office and later copyright operations, it would more or less make up for the loss. Sony Pictures was not only involved in the production, but they were also the main distributor. Their losses were much greater than Firefly's. More importantly, the failure of this project did not affect Firefly much. Instead, it was a huge blow to Sony Pictures' movie business. The only consolation was that the box office for Game of Bravehearts 2 was not strong enough. That was why it did not affect the box office for Men in Black 2. After the $75 million in the first week, the box office for Men in Black 2 dropped by 31% and earned $52.09 million. The total box office for 2 weeks was $127 million. In the third week, the box office for The Breakin' Doll 2 dropped from 43% to 25%. The box office for the week was $32.49 million. The total box office for the week was $156 million. Also, as there were no strong new films coming out during the summer, the box office for both Men in Black 2 and The Breakin' Doll 2 would last longer. When Eric heard about the news, he asked about the progress of Sony's Godzilla. Godzilla will start filming in New York in June. But the filming for Godzilla was much shorter than Casino Royale. It only needs 3 months. Of course, as a CG blockbuster, the post-production period was much longer than Casino Royale. According to Sony Pictures' release schedule, the film will be released during next year's summer. Although Sony had not confirmed the release date, there is still a high possibility that there will be a clash between Casino Royale and Godzilla next year, just like this year's Thunderbolt Girls 2 and Men in Black 2. Eric remembered the image of a certain Tyrannosaurus Rex, and started to look forward to next year's summer. Next year is 1997. What year is that? The Asian financial crisis. In his memory, although Japan was not directly affected by the crisis, the whole Southeast Asian economy will be affected. Under such circumstances, Sony will not have a good time. If they suffer another failure in their movie business, they will be in trouble. TSK. Just thinking about it makes Fong you happy. Soon, it was August. 2 weeks of filming in the Czech Republic had passed. The crew moved to Italy again. The filming period in Italy was 1 month. There were 2 important scenes, which were the gambling scene between Bond and the villain Cheever at the Casino Royale, and the death of Vesper, played by Cate Blanchett. At the same time, the Breakin' Doll trio and Vesper's sister will appear in Italy for a short time. Charlie and the other 2 were promoting The Breakin' Doll 2 overseas. Their schedule was very tight. Their scenes were mainly focused on the British mainland, which was the rescue of Vesper's sister, Angela Lind. If they didn't make it in time, the 3 women might return to Italy for a short reshoot after they finished filming in the United Kingdom. Although the trio could not make it to Italy immediately, Christina Aguilera, who played Vesper's sister, Angela Rinder, joined the crew after the crew moved to Italy. However, while the crew was busy filming, Eric had to pay attention to another matter. After the meeting, with the help of Firefly, the Venice Film Festival quickly agreed to use Titanic as the opening film of this year's Venice Film Festival. After all, because of Eric's indulgence, when Cameron completed the film, the overall cost of Titanic had reached an unprecedented $215 million, $15 million more than in the original universe. Although the Venice Film Festival had always adhered to a cold artistic style, it was difficult for them to reject a film that could be recorded in the Guinness Book of World Records. When the Venice Film Festival sent out the official invitation and released the news to the media, Cameron had already arrived in Venice with the sample film. It was August 3rd. Eric had just finished a day's work. Before he had time to rest, he heard from Peter Ritchie that Cameron had arrived. In the hotel where the crew was staying, Eric saw the unshaven Cameron again. Although Eric had reassured Cameron knew that if this film with a cost of more than $200 million failed, it would be a huge blow to his career. Therefore, his hair had obviously turned white these days. "Hey, Eric, how's the film going?" Seeing Eric walk into the lobby, Cameron, who had been waiting for him in the lobby, immediately came up to him. Everything went well. Eric hugged Cameron gently. He looked at the guy's haggard face and smiled. "Let's go eat first. The food in this hotel restaurant is good. After dinner, we'll watch the film together." "Of course." Cameron nodded. Because the two of them were a little absent-minded, the meal was quickly finished. After quickly filling their stomachs, the two of them went into the hotel's private screening room. "The film might be a bit long," Cameron said when the lights dimmed. He then said, "But I think it's best not to trim it." Although he said this, Cameron's tone was obviously not very firm. Eric had given him the greatest support in terms of the film budget. Cameron was not a completely unreasonable person. When he was in Hollywood, he could yell at Katzenberg, "If you want to cut the film, kill me first." But if Eric insisted, Cameron would try his best to reduce the length of the film. The film in front of them was 187 minutes long. In the entire history of Hollywood, the only film that lasted more than 3 hours and achieved box office success was 1939's Gone with the Wind. Other than that, most similar films might have achieved some artistic achievements, but there were very few that could achieve high box office results. After all, for a movie, only 3 hours was enough to make most of the audience flinch. Although Cameron was very confident in his work, he did not think that Titanic could be compared to Gone with the Wind, a legendary film with epic-making significance. The idea of shooting Titanic was deliberately led by Eric when he was chatting with several famous directors and producers at Praia Vista Studios. Eric also participated in the writing of part of the script. Therefore, the plot of the new version of Titanic was roughly the same as the original. The biggest difference was undoubtedly the female lead. Compared to Fat Wen, Rachel Weisz, who had a slender figure, an elegant temperament, a delicate face, and a rebellious heart, was undoubtedly more suitable for the role of Rose. When the elderly Rose began to reminisce about the past on the big screen, Rachel appeared for the first time. Her tall and slender figure, classic makeup, as well as the proud aura of a British noble lady, stunned Eric. He even felt that some of his regrets had been made up for. Cameron's control of the plot was undoubtedly at the master level. Although the whole film was 3 hours and 7 minutes long, every minute of the plot was able to firmly drive the audience's emotions, and it did not give the audience the slightest feeling of superfluity. The scenes of the Titanic sailing on the sea, Jack and Rose hugging each other at the bow of the ship at sunset, and the industrial atmosphere in the cabin, brought about almost breathtaking beauty and shock. Although the disaster in the second half of the film was short, whether it was the good and evil of human nature at the moment of the disaster, or the scene of Jack and Rose parting, it was enough to deeply touch the audience's heart. Eric had seen Titanic many times before, but as a reborn person, seeing another perfect version of Titanic again, his blood still surged. When the film ended, Eric did not realize that more than 3 hours had passed unknowingly. He turned his head to say something to Cameron, and suddenly noticed that the pure music at the end of the film was still playing. That's right, it was a pure music that combined piano, bagpipes, violin, and other instruments. Although it still sounded beautiful, it had nothing to do with the original My Heart Will Go On. Chapter 803. Cameron saw that Eric, who was about to speak, suddenly turned his eyes to the screen. He asked curiously, "Eric, what do you think?" Eric stopped thinking about it and nodded. "It's a perfect film, Jim. I just think there are some small flaws at the end of the film." Eric didn't immediately ask about the length of the film, so Cameron was a little relieved. He said, "Are you talking about the scene where Rose dreams of Titanic? If I remember correctly, you were the one who suggested adding that scene. I think the effect is pretty good." "No, not that part," Eric shook his head and said, "I'm talking about the ending song. Although the music is good, I still feel that it's a little monotonous. Maybe it would be better to change it to a song." "Did you guys discuss this possibility when James was the composer?" The James that Eric was talking about was James Horner, the composer of Titanic. In his memory, My Heart Will Go On was a collaborative work between James Horner and another composer. Eric didn't know how Cameron and James Horner worked together in his previous life, because he learned that during the production of Alien 2 in 1986, Cameron and James Horner had a bad relationship over the years due to their different ideologies. In order to preserve the original flavor of Titanic as much as possible, Eric personally invited James Horner to be the composer of the film and personally came forward to mediate between the two. Before the shooting of Casino Royale, he, Cameron, and James Horner had a meal together in Praia Vista. When Cameron heard Eric's question, he shook his head and said, "James did write a song. It was inspired by the last scene of the film. It's called In My Dreams. I felt that the mood of the lyrics didn't fit the theme of the film, so I only used the music version. It's the ending song we just heard." Eric told the projectionist to put the ending song aside and asked Cameron for the details of the lyrics. In the end, he just shook his head in disappointment. This song wasn't as classic as My Heart Will Go On. In fact, writing a song was like writing a poem or painting. It required inspiration. Eric should have thought of it from the beginning. The main body of Titanic could maintain the same style as the original under his influence, but when it came to the ending song, it was impossible for James Horner to have the same inspiration as in his previous life under the influence of Eric. In the original space-time, the success of Titanic benefited from the overall quality of the film. However, to use of My Heart Will Go On wasn't the finishing touch of the film, it was definitely a sublimation of Titanic. Eric didn't want to miss it. After thinking about it, he said, "James shouldn't be too busy recently. When I just watched the film, I happened to have some inspiration. If he can come to Italy, maybe we can come up with a good ending song before the Venice Film Festival." Cameron liked the song New Divide that Eric came up with very much. He also watched the complete video of the first Victoria's Secret show, so he didn't doubt that Eric had the ability to compose an ending song for Titanic. He just said, "Eric, if you're in Los Angeles, it's not likely that James will come to Italy. He's already working on the soundtrack for Edward Zwick's Life and Death. Speaking of which, if you have the inspiration, why don't you do it yourself?" Eric spread his hands and said, "It's not like you don't know what I've been doing recently. I may be able to come up with the lyrics and music, but I don't have the time to arrange and record the specific work." Cameron said, "Eric, although it's impossible that James just came over, as long as you can come up with the lyrics and music, Europe is so big. You'll definitely be able to find an excellent musician to help arrange the music. Even if the effect is still not good, the film won't be released until the end of the year. We still have enough time to modify it, don't you think? In that case, it should be too late for the screening at the Venice Film Festival, right? Just treat it as a surprise for the audience," Cameron said. "Of course, this must be under the condition that the song you write is good enough. Otherwise, I definitely won't use it. I don't want a bad song to ruin the whole film." In the end, Cameron's tone became habitually critical. Eric narrowed his eyes and nodded gently. Then he said, "Okay, let's talk about the director's problem." Of course, Cameron could tell that Eric was fighting back against his words, but he almost jumped up and said, "Hey, Eric, you're not such a petty person." "Of course so." Eric reached out and patted Cameron's shoulder. Seeing that Cameron's eyes were wide open and his expression was obviously lifted, he stopped panting and said, "I don't think we should change it for a minute. We'll release it according to this version." Haha, I knew it. Cameron suddenly turned from worry to joy. He even wanted to say something, but he immediately stopped himself. Cameron originally wanted to say that since this version was approved by Liu Zhou, he could not be blamed if the box office did not do well. But he quickly realized that if he really said that, he would be too irresponsible. Cameron put away these thoughts and raised his fist to hit Eric's shoulder. He said, "Eric, I recently took some time to read some Spider-Man comics, and I have some good ideas. Well, if, when the time comes, you still want me to film it, just let me know. No matter what, this project is yours." "We discussed it," Eric said. "Or, I can ask Los Angeles to send the contract over tomorrow." Cameron was a sentimental person. He remembered that since last year, Eric had maintained a supportive attitude towards him. Now that he heard these words, he could not help but feel emotional. He said, "Eric, I can only promise you that I will do my best." Eric was not good at having a heart-to-heart talk with a man. Seeing that Cameron was being serious, he laughed and said, "It's still early. Why don't we go downstairs to the bar for a drink?" Cameron also quickly collected his emotions and nodded freely. He said, "Of course, well, but I have to personally send the copy to the bank safe first. The copy in front of us is worth $215 million US. If there is an accident, our 2 years of hard work may be in vain." As the two spoke, they got up together and left the screening room. Christina Aguilera had been with the crew for a week. She came to Italy on August 1st. The entire crew did not include the more mobile extras. There were more than 200 permanent staff and actors, and they lived in several different hotels. Because she joined the crew at the last minute, she was not arranged to stay in the same hotel as Eric, but across the street. Christina had very few scenes in Venice. The specific plot was that Angela Lin had to be kidnapped by the Phantom Gang and brought to Venice to threaten her sister, Vesper Lin, to hand over the huge sum of money. Because she was only tied to a chair for a short scene to prove to Vesper Lin that her sister was still alive, she would then be brought back to the United Kingdom. Therefore, she did not even have a line in Venice, and no one could pay attention to her. However, because she had a work pass as a crew member, although Eric only took time out to say hello to her, Christina could enter the set every day and stand outside to watch the process of Eric shooting the movie. After seeing Eric commanding the entire huge crew like a king, Christina felt more and more insignificant. It was inevitable that she would worship him like a little girl. Another day of filming ended. In the evening, Christina and her assistant Milia left the set early and found a restaurant to have dinner while discussing the recent gossip they had heard. Although Milia was 10 years older than Christina, she was a chatterbox. She chattered endlessly. "I heard that Pierce Brosnan was scolded by Mr. Williams again. It seems like he can't keep up with your sister's pace. Now, many media outlets in North America are still saying that your sister is not beautiful enough, but I think many people will be surprised when the movie is released in the future. Well, I just don't know how Mr. Williams found such an actress. She didn't even have a single film in Hollywood before." Before the start of filming, the news that Cate Blanchett was the new Bond girl was released, and it caused a lot of media outlets to discuss it crazily. Most of the comments said that Cate Blanchett's appearance was not outstanding enough to play the role of a Bond girl. Although Cate won a lot of support in the end with her professional appearance, the overall trend was still that she was not suitable for the role. However, during the recent filming, Cate's role as Vesper Lynd was very eye-catching. Many times, she even completely overshadowed Pierce Brosnan's limelight. After all, if the Bond girl this time was just a pretty face like before, it would be difficult for Pierce Brosnan's limelight to be stolen. However, Vesper Lynd was a female character with a very distinct personality. Therefore, it gave Cate a great platform to showcase her extremely talented and skillful acting skills. After all, this was a 007 movie. Although Eric wanted Cate to be more outstanding, he would not allow her to completely overshadow Pierce Brosnan. Therefore, while adjusting Pierce Brosnan's acting skills, Eric had to slightly suppress Cate's sharpness. Of course, although the news of the male lead being overshadowed by Cate Blanchett was kept under wraps, there was still a lot of news that leaked out. It was an open secret within the crew. As for the news that spread to the media, most of it was treated as a publicity stunt by the crew, and it did not attract much attention. Christina was a little absent-minded as she ate her ice cream with a spoon. She listened to Milia's words and said, "Milia, can you not always say, 'my sister'? It sounds weird. I've only spoken a few words with Miss Blanchett." "Hey, I'm helping you get into character," Milia said. "Think about it." Even Pierce Brosnan was scolded. "If you don't perform well in the future, Mr. Williams won't be too polite." Christina had already memorized the few pages of her script by heart. She had also rehearsed her lines with Milia countless times. At this time, she was already at the point where she could blurt out her lines. With a few years of acting experience in the Mickey Mouse Club, although Christina was a little worried about her performance, she was not afraid of stage fright. "Eric is a very nice person. I don't think he'll scold me," Christina said with some uncertainty. After all, little girls had their own fantasies. Although Milia looked a little careless, she would never take the initiative to touch on certain sensitive topics, such as the relationship between the employer in front of her and Eric Williams. Therefore, after hearing Christina's words, she didn't refute. However, with more experience than Christina, she knew very well that most of the directors in Hollywood had different personalities on set and in private. No matter how gentlemanly they were in private, once they were in the director's mode, this group of people would often become harsh and manic. The better the director, the more likely it was like this. Eric might be very gentle to Christina in private, but if Christina's performance during filming was not good and affected the progress of the crew, she would definitely be scolded. According to the gossip in the circle, when Julia Roberts was filming Pretty Woman a few years ago, she was scolded more than once by Eric Williams. There were even rumors that she was scolded until she had problems or something. After a while, Milia started a new topic and said, "Let's not talk about this." "Well, wake up early tomorrow. I heard that there's an explosion scene tomorrow morning. It must be very exciting. I haven't seen it before." Christina was about to answer when a man in his 30s walked in from the door of the restaurant. The two girls looked at him at the same time and vaguely remembered that he should be Eric's assistant. Before they could react, the man had already walked towards them. "Miss Aguilera, you're here. I've been looking for you for a while." Christina quickly got up and asked, "Is Eric looking for me?" "Yes." "Oh, let me introduce myself. I'm Peter Ritchie." The man introduced himself and greeted Milia. Then he said, "Come with me. Mr. Williams is waiting for you." "Oh, okay." Christina originally wanted to ask why Eric was looking for her, but when she saw that Peter Ritchie had already turned and walked out, she dismissed the thought and hurriedly followed him. Milia quickly paid the bill, picked up the bag that Christina had left on the seat, and followed him out. Chapter 804. When they arrived at the hotel room where Eric was staying, Peter Ritchie knocked on the door. After getting a response, he pushed the door open and said to Christina, who was behind him, "Miss Aguilera, please go in. The boss is waiting for you." Christina subconsciously glanced at her assistant, Milia, who was behind her. Peter Ritchie noticed her gaze and said, "Oh, this is Milia Anton," said Milia quickly. Peter Ritchie nodded and said, "Miss Austen, you can go back to the hotel first." "Oh, of course." Milia was a little disappointed that she could not go in to see Eric, but she did not dare to refute. When she saw Christina enter the room, she reluctantly turned around and left. Christina thought that Eric was alone in the room. After she entered the room, she realized that Eric was discussing something with another middle-aged man around a piano near the balcony. Cameron first noticed Christina entering the room. When he saw the petite and sweet-looking girl in front of him, he subconsciously asked, "Eric, is this the singer you found?" Although Christina knew about the Terminator series and had also heard about Titanic, which had been hotly discussed by the media for the past 6 months, she did not recognize Cameron. However, the girl was very perceptive. When she saw Cameron leaning against the piano with his slightly wrinkled shirt and messy hair, she realized that he was at least Eric's good friend. Otherwise, he would not dare to be so sloppy in front of Eric. Therefore, although Cameron's tone was full of doubt, Christina still smiled at him. When she saw Eric turn around, she quickly greeted him. "Eric, are you looking for me?" Eric sat beside the piano and had no intention of getting up. He only nodded at her and said, "Yes, come here." Christina obediently walked to the other side of Eric and looked around curiously. There were a few manuscripts in front of Eric and on the piano table. They seemed to be music scores. Cameron and Eric each had a pencil in their hands. The manuscripts were also full of annotations. Seeing the girl's lively eyes looking around and landing on Cameron, Eric smiled and introduced them. "Here, this is Christina Aguilera. Oh, this is James Cameron. You must have heard of him." "Of course." Christina nodded. Although she had subconsciously stood on the other side of Eric, the girl still extended her small hand and said, "Director Cameron, hello. I like your movies very much." "Oh, really?" Cameron shook Christina's small hand and jokingly said, "You don't look old enough to watch my movies." Before Titanic, other than Abyss, Cameron's movies were all R-rated. That meant that children under the age of 17 would need to be accompanied by their parents to watch them. He did not think that the girl in front of him, who was just over 1.5 meters tall, had watched his movies. Even if she had, she probably would not have liked them too much. With that said, Cameron turned his gaze to Eric. Since Eric had called the girl to his side, he was sure that she was the person Eric was looking for. For the past few days, Eric spent his free time every night composing the lyrics and melody for My Heart Will Go On. Today he had completed the basic work. Although he and Cameron could already hum the melody, it was difficult for two grown men to sing the melody of My Heart Will Go On. Cameron suggested that they find a female singer to try it out. Eric immediately thought of Christina, who had just joined the cast a few days ago. Putting aside the fact that in the original space-time, Christina's singing was powerful enough to squeeze into the 100 greatest singers of all time at such a young age, ever since she came into contact with music, Christina imitated the path of female singers like Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey. Therefore, although she did not have Celine Dion's natural voice, in terms of singing, she did not lose to Celine Dion, who had a single musical style. Eric arranged the score in front of him and explained, "Jim, we're just looking for a girl to try out the effect of this song. Also, I assure you that in our entire crew, Christina is definitely the best singer." "Alright, I hope so." Cameron would not be too serious with Eric since they were just trying out the song. However, Eric smiled and asked Christina, who was beside him, 4 years ago, Whitney Houston acted in The Bodyguard. "Do you know how to sing the theme song of that movie?" Christina said, "Is it, I Will Always Love You?" Eric nodded and waved at Cameron. He smiled and said, "Show Jim a few lines." Although the singing style of I Will Always Love You was different from My Heart Will Go On, both songs were lyrical songs. Moreover, I Will Always Love You was even more difficult to sing than My Heart Will Go On. Cameron also liked music, so it was impossible for him not to know this. Christina frequently went on stage since she was 8 years old, so she did not have any stage fright in her heart. She took 2 small steps back, gathered her emotions, and began to sing. If I should stay I would only bow, and I'll think of every step of the way. Cameron originally looked like he was watching a good show with interest, but as the petite girl sang with an explosive and rich soprano voice that was almost exactly the same as Whitney Houston's, Cameron quickly put away his nonchalant expression. He even looked Christina up and down with a face full of surprise, as if he was trying to figure out how this small body in front of him could display such a powerful explosive power. There were still a lot of things to do at the moment, but Eric did not have the patience to wait for Christina to finish singing. When Cameron's expression began to change, Eric smiled and interrupted the girl, saying, "All right, let's stop here." Christina paused and quickly stopped singing. She thought that she did not sing well. She blinked and stood on the spot, a hint of helplessness flashing in her eyes. This time, Cameron began to fight for justice for Christina. He said, "Hey, Eric, why didn't you let Christina finish singing? You're so rude." Eric ignored this arrogant guy and said to Christina, "It's okay, you sang very well. It's just that we're a little pressed for time. Come, take a look at these scores first. Sing for us later." Christina realized that there was nothing wrong with her and relaxed. She did not forget to smile politely at Cameron, who spoke up for her. She walked over and took the scores from Eric's hands. "This is the theme song for a movie that I just wrote. Jim wants to hear the effect, so he asked you to come over," Eric said. When he saw Christina standing next to him and looking at the scores, he turned his head and said to Cameron, who was leaning against the piano, "Buddy, can you bring a chair over for our little singer?" I can do it myself," Christina, who had already begun to hum softly, quickly said when she heard that. She did not dare to let a great director like Cameron move a chair for her. However, before the girl could move, Cameron had already passed a chair behind him to her. He said, "Here, little girl." "Oh no, Christina, take it." It was a very heavy, solid wooden chair. Cameron did not feel anything when he picked it up, so he passed it over casually. However, Christina had a hard time picking it up. Eric quickly got up and helped to place the chair behind Christina. Christina sat down and began to read the scores carefully. Although she did not have any talent in composing, she had been taking music lessons continuously all these years. It was still very easy for her to read the scores. When Eric saw the girl looking down at the scores, he knew that they might have to wait for a while. Taking advantage of this time, he got up and walked to the fridge. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and a glass of juice and handed them to Cameron and Christina. He held a glass for himself and chatted casually with Cameron. He said, "I think we can consider the Scottish whistle for the beginning arrangement. This instrument has appeared a few times in the movie, and it fits very well with the female singing at the end of the plot." Scottish whistle. Cameron thought for a while and said, "Oh, I remember now. James did say that there is such an instrument here. I don't know if it can be bought in Venice. If you want to hear the effect, you can get the assistant to look for it tomorrow." Cameron nodded. Seeing that Christina was still reading the score line by line, he said, "Eric, this is too slow. Why don't you sing it for her? I think Christina will learn it after listening to it once or twice." Eric looked at Christina. Seeing the girl nod, he took the score and said, "All right, I'll sing it a cappella first. Listen to it." Christina's musical talent was indeed very strong. Eric only had to sing it softly once, and Christina could roughly understand the lyrics. Eric also instructed the girl on some of the pronunciation methods. After practicing a few times, Eric and Cameron listened to the professional female singer's "My Heart Will Go On" with the accompaniment of the piano. As Christina deliberately suppressed her voice according to Eric's request, she did not display the masculine and fierce voice that she was good at. Therefore, the girl's cover of "My Heart Will Go On" had a hint of Celine Dion's natural charm. At least, Eric and Cameron were very satisfied listening to it. After Christina finished singing for the 3rd time, Cameron clapped his hands excitedly and said, "Great, very great. Eric, I've decided to use this song as the ending song for Titanic. Yes, I think I should have this song completed before the Venice Film Festival because this song and the film are a perfect match. I don't want to wait a moment longer. I'll fly back to Los Angeles tomorrow and get James to arrange the song as soon as possible. We'll try to finish it before the film festival." This kind of song was very taxing. After Christina finished singing, she was sipping her juice. When she heard Cameron say that this song was going to be the theme song for Titanic, she was a little surprised. Although many people were pessimistic that Titanic would be the next future Waterworld, it was still a blockbuster movie that cost $215 million. If she could sing the theme song for such a movie, then, with that thought in mind, Christina put down her glass and blinked at Eric. "There are still 20 days before the opening ceremony. I think if we rush it a little, it shouldn't be a problem." Eric also nodded. Cameron had originally planned to take his time to compose this song if it was suitable. However, at this moment, he was on a whim and did not object to making the premiere of Titanic more perfect at the opening ceremony of the Venice Film Festival, so he replied. At the same time, he felt Christina's little face looking at him with anticipation. Eric smiled and reached out to pinch Christina's face. He said, "Don't think about it. This song isn't suitable for you. You can't go down the path of lyrical songs. Firefly Records will be releasing a single for you at the end of the year, so it's better to work hard according to the route the company has prepared for you. Christina shrunk her neck, but she did not resist Eric's slightly intimate action at all. She smiled and said, "Yes, I know, Eric." However, Cameron sensitively noticed the interaction between the two. His eyes flashed and he raised his hand to look at his watch. Unknowingly, it was already 9:15 at night. "All right, Eric, I'll go back and prepare now. I'll fly back to Los Angeles tomorrow." Cameron finished the whiskey in his glass, straightened up, and waved at Christina. "Good night." Christina replied politely, "Good night, Mr. Cameron." Eric got up and walked Cameron to the door. Cameron saw that Christina did not follow, so he reached out and pulled Eric out of the door. He whispered, "Hey, Eric, although I don't want to interfere with your private matters, but..." He pointed into the house and lowered his voice again. "How old is she?" Eric shrugged helplessly and said, 16. "Really?" Cameron was in disbelief. After all, compared to the average height of Western girls, Christina, who was only about 1.5 meters tall, seemed a little too petite. "Of course." Eric nodded with certainty and said, "Also Jim, I haven't touched her. In general, I'm still a decent person." Cameron also knew that Eric had no reason to lie to him about these things. He shrugged and suddenly made a pinching gesture in the air. He smiled and said, "You really haven't touched her?" Eric smiled and reached out to hit Cameron's shoulder. He said, "All right, go back and book your flight tickets. Tomorrow, get your ass back to Los Angeles and work for me." "Hey you." Cameron was not annoyed. He chatted with Eric for a while more before leaving. Eric returned to his suite. Christina was still sitting on the chair and reading the music score, looking like an obedient little girl. Walking to the piano, Eric casually played a few keys and said, "Let's go, Christina. I'll send you back. You seem to be staying in the hotel facing the street, right?" Christina, who was originally burying her head in pretense, raised her little head. Her face was slightly red, but she mustered her courage and said, "Eric, can I stay?" How old are you?" Eric asked subconsciously. 16. Christina's bright eyes flashed as she answered with a smile. She even imitated Eric's tone when he answered Cameron. Eric smiled and reached out to pinch Christina's face again. He said, "Eavesdropping on other people's conversations is not a good habit." This time, Christina boldly grabbed Eric's hand and pressed it to her chest. She blinked and stared at Eric. Her face became even redder. She said, "Then, Eric, punish me." Chapter 805. Faintly feeling that someone was staring at her, Christina Aguilera opened her eyes and happened to notice Eric sitting by the bed with a smile. The various scenes from last night quickly rushed into her mind. Feeling the body under the thin blanket and the big bed without any hindrance, Christina blushed slightly and pulled at the corner of the blanket. She greeted softly, "Good morning, Eric. Seeing that you're sleeping so soundly, I didn't know if I should wake you up." Eric reached over and gently brushed away a strand of messy hair on the girl's cheek. Seeing that she was a little nervous, he asked, "Are you still not feeling well?" "Yes, I feel like there's something." Christina's eyelashes drooped and she was a little embarrassed to stop halfway through her sentence. "Then rest here for the next few days. The place you're staying at is definitely not as good as here. I've ordered breakfast for you. When you wake up, call customer service and they'll send it over. If you need anything else, you can also call my assistant," Eric said as he placed a small card on the bedside table. "This is his number." Christina looked at Eric a little dejectedly and said, "Are you going to work?" "Yes, it's already 8 o'clock. There are hundreds of people waiting for me." Christina nodded and said obediently, "Okay, then, goodbye." "Goodbye." Eric leaned over and kissed the girl's cheek. Christina boldly raised her little head and kissed him back. She even naughtily stuck out the tip of her tongue and licked Eric's face. Eric did not mind. He smiled and said, "You're really like a kitten." Christina giggled and said, Eric, you seem to like cats very much. No, I don't like cats. I like women who are like cats. Docile, lazy, mysterious. Of course, occasionally wild and untamed. Christina blinked quickly and said, Then, can I be your kitten? No problem. Eric smiled and pinched Christina's cheek. He stood up and said, Then I'll go back to work. I'll bring you out to play during this week's break. Where do you want to go? Christina looked excited, but then she said, I'm not familiar with Venice. I'll go wherever you go, Eric. We can't do that. The Venice Film Festival is about to start, and we are filming here. There are too many reporters in Venice these days. If we play here, we will definitely be chased and intercepted. We have to go further away. How about Paris? Christina's little head was still spinning. Of course, she wanted to go to Paris. Which girl didn't want to go to Paris? However, the crew only had one day off every week. Could they go that far? Eric could guess Christina's thoughts from her confused expression. He pinched her cheeks and did not explain. He smiled and said, Paris it is then. I'll go to work first. You can continue sleeping. You can wake up whenever you want. She waved at Eric and waited patiently for him to disappear. Finally, she heard the soft sound of the door closing in the living room. After lazing in bed for a while, Christina got out of bed. She called her assistant, Milia, and vaguely explained that she had stayed at the hotel where Eric was staying last night. She did not make it clear. She believed that her assistant was aware and told her to do whatever she wanted for the next few days. Christina hung up the phone and called room service for breakfast. After filling her stomach, the girl threw herself onto the big bed and fell asleep quickly. When she woke up again, it was already evening. There was almost no light coming in from outside the thick curtains. There were faint sounds of people talking in the living room. Christina quietly put on her clothes and walked to the door to open it. She only walked out when she saw that Eric was alone in the living room, talking on the phone. When Eric saw Christina walk out of the bedroom, he nodded at her and pointed at the sofa opposite him. Christina walked over and sat down on the sofa. She was only wearing a tight t-shirt and jeans. She was barefooted. Although the floor was very clean, there was no carpet. She felt that the floor was a little cold. She curled up her legs and hugged a pillow as she curled up on the sofa. She quietly listened to Eric on the phone. If that's the case, we can accept the price of $300 million. Eric held the phone with one hand and flipped through the blue folder on his lap. He was discussing something with the person on the other end. However, we can't compromise on the payment terms. If Amberlin wants the copyright of The Matrix, they have to pay in full as soon as possible after signing the contract. It's only $300 million. Jeffrey, with the power of Microsoft behind Amberlin, as long as they are serious about this deal, they can definitely come up with the money. When Christina heard Eric casually mention $300 million, she stuck her tongue out. She also knew that Firefly was selling the rights to the sequel of The Matrix, but she didn't expect the rights to be so valuable. $300 million. Eric happened to notice Christina sticking her tongue out. He thought that the girl was being naughty and waved his hand at her, indicating that she shouldn't be naughty. Christina shrunk her neck and smiled at Eric. There's one more thing. After Eric finished talking with Katzenberg about The Matrix, he continued, I've seen the finished film of Titanic. Other than the ending song, there are no problems. Jim flew back to Los Angeles this morning to settle the new ending song. I wrote the song myself. Get the record department to cooperate and try to get it done before the opening ceremony of the Venice Film Festival. Also, the publicity work can start now. I don't plan to compress the film anymore, so get the distribution department to discuss the corresponding publicity plan. Battlestar Cop 2? Eric hesitated, thought for a while, and said, It's better not to release it at the same time as Titanic. I know you guys don't have much confidence in this film. We have no right to interfere with other companies' plans, but Firefly can't possibly attack itself. Let's postpone it and release it during the summer next year. This sequel should have the ability to support the summer. Well, that's it then. After hanging up the phone, Eric smiled and waved at Christina when he saw that she was listening to him attentively. Christina hugged a pillow and sat down beside Eric. She curled up her legs and gently leaned against Eric. She looked at the document on his lap and said, "Eric, what's this?" Eric knew that the girl wasn't really interested. She just wanted to find a topic to talk about. He said, "Nothing, some copyright transfer contract information." Christina glanced at the document a few times, but she was smart enough not to read it in detail. She asked, "Is it The Matrix?" "Yes." Eric nodded and flipped to the first page of the document. He wanted to read it again. He felt Christina's small body rubbing against him from time to time. He smiled and said, "Looking at you just now, you should be fine now, right?" "Ah." Christina was stunned. Soon, she pitifully begged for mercy. Eric, tonight, I can't do it yet." Eric smiled. His eyes were still on the document in front of him, but he changed the topic. He said, "What do you want to eat tonight?" Christina was still worried that Eric would torture her again at night. If that was the case, she felt that she might be ruined. When she heard Eric change the topic, she replied absent-mindedly, "I don't know. Breakfast, it's not bad." "That's breakfast." Eric said, "Forget it. Call room service and ask them to send a menu over. You can choose what you want to eat." "Okay." Christina nodded. She thought for a while and gently tugged at Eric's t-shirt sleeve. She looked like she wanted to say something but stopped herself. Eric turned his head and saw Christina's pitiful expression. He recalled what she said just now and understood. It had to be said that Christina was in the best period of her life. She had a sweet face, a petite body, and a slender body. Coupled with her pitiful expression that said, "Don't bully me, okay?" she could indeed arouse a man's desire to ravage her. "Don't think too much. You just need to rest well these few days." Eric smiled and reached out to pinch the girl's face. He said, "If you don't want to stay here, you can go back to the hotel by the street." When she heard this, she remembered Eric's overall gentle behavior last night. Christina was relieved. She smiled sweetly and said, "I'm not leaving." "Well, I'm going to call for the menu." As the girl said this, she jumped off the sofa and reached out to pick up the mobile phone Eric had just put down. She began to dial. Eric smiled and turned his attention to the document in his hand again. Because he was far away from Hollywood, Eric did not personally experience the various activities in Hollywood recently, especially the sale of the copyright of The Matrix. There was no doubt that, just as Eric had guessed, the company that wanted the copyright of The Matrix the most was still Amblin Pictures, which was backed by Microsoft. Of course, several other major film companies were also more or less involved in this copyright competition. Of course, Firefly would not sell the copyright of The Matrix so easily. In fact, a large portion of the senior management did not want to sell The Matrix at all. They just wanted to drag this matter on and let it slowly fall apart in the end. Therefore, Firefly's attitude was quite firm. When negotiating with the film companies that were interested in buying the copyright of The Matrix, they would not budge an inch. Under such circumstances, the relatively conservative companies such as Paramount withdrew one after another. In the end, only Warner Brothers, Universal, and Amblin were still holding on. However, because Firefly's conditions were more stringent, they were only willing to sell the production and distribution rights of The Matrix sequels, but they still retained the development rights of all non-film and television-related products such as comics, games, toys, and so on. In addition, the asking price was too high. Warner Brothers and Universal withdrew one after another. In the end, only Amblin was left and agreed to Firefly's request. According to the preliminary agreement, Amblin Pictures would buy the film and television production and distribution rights of The Matrix for $300 million in cash. The agreement did not stipulate that Amblin could only produce 2 sequels. In the future, if Amblin Pictures wanted to reboot the series, Firefly would not object. Of course, most fans of The Matrix knew the script of the trilogy. Presumably, after this incident, Amblin would not be able to resist the pressure to change the script. However, the agreement also stipulated that Firefly would retain the development rights of The Matrix comics, games, toys, and so on. This also included the development rights of The Matrix sequels and characters. Firefly would not participate in any of the distribution profits of The Matrix sequels, such as cinemas, DVDs, videotapes, and so on. At the same time, Amblin Pictures had no right to participate in any of the distribution profits of the Matrix series. Although Amblin Pictures was ambitious, after all, they had just been established. At the moment, their most important task was to improve their distribution network. They did not have the ability to develop other products. Therefore, they agreed to this proposal. The development of other products happened to be Firefly's forte. Based on the cumulative global box office of The Matrix, which was about $600 million, Firefly's net income from theatrical screenings and videotapes alone was more than $300 million. However, even if The Matrix sequels did not follow the same path as in his previous life, Firefly would not lose out on this deal. Because of the overall recovery of the American economy, they had recovered $300 million in cash a few years in advance. Whether this money was invested in the entertainment industry or the high-tech industry, Eric was confident that this amount of money would multiply several times in the next few years. Although in the eyes of outsiders, Firefly's profits in recent years were very terrifying, only Eric himself knew that the Firefly system was burning money crazily in recent years. Most of the annual profits were quickly reinvested into the various companies under the Firefly system. In order to reduce the tax burden as much as possible, Eric had even begun to consider directly investing in the companies under Firefly Investments in the name of Firefly Group. Although this would indirectly involve about 27% of Firefly's minority shareholders in the Firefly System's internet industry, it could save a lot of tax in the middle. When the surplus funds were directly transferred to project investment, the pre-tax gross profit of Firefly Group would be greatly reduced, but this would also allow Firefly to reduce the amount of corporate income tax paid. With Firefly's scale, the pre-tax profit and income tax ratio reached 35%, which was much higher than the 27% ratio of small and medium shareholders. Moreover, if the benefits were distributed to the small and medium shareholders in the form of investment, it would definitely gain the favor of these shareholders and increase Eric's control over Firefly, as well as the support of the forces behind these shareholders. However, if it was handed over to the IRS, Firefly would not get any substantial benefits. Thinking of this, Eric also made up his mind to discuss the matter of Clover Holdings, which originally belonged to the Disney Group, with Katzenberg on the next call. This was an investment company left over from the Disney era, but it had always been very small. If one did not carefully read the balance sheet of Firefly Group, most people would not even notice the existence of this investment company. Although Disney had developed rapidly, it did not have much energy to involve external investment. The largest investment project of Clover Holdings was to assist in the construction of the Disney Concert Hall in the Los Angeles Music Center. The investment scale was $20 million. However, that project had not made much profit so far because the project was initiated by the Disney family. The main purpose was to expand the influence of the Disney family. It was a very public welfare project. However, at this time, this investment company could be used as a window for Firefly Group's direct investment. The company law in the United States was very loose. It did not stipulate that a company could only operate in certain industries. For example, Berkshire Hathaway, which was controlled by Buffett, was only a textile factory at the beginning. Now, it had become a comprehensive holding group, operating in various industries such as insurance, books, beverages, candy, entertainment, and so on. Chapter 806. Because Charlie's Angel Trio was busy with the global promotion of Charlie's Angels 2, they were unable to catch up with the filming of Casino Royale in Italy. Therefore, the originally planned month-long filming period in Italy ended 2 days before the opening of the Venice Film Festival. Most of the crew began to move to the United Kingdom. Eric was invited by the organizers of the Venice Film Festival to attend the opening ceremony of the 53rd Venice Film Festival and the premiere of Titanic that night. Cameron returned to Los Angeles at the beginning of the month. With the support of Firefly Records, He successfully completed the recording of My Heart Will Go On in 3 weeks. The singer he chose was still Celine Dion. With the intervention of Eric's remote phone call, the song was almost the same as the original version. A new copy of the film with the revised ending song was also sent to Los Angeles on September 28, the day before the opening ceremony. These days, because the crew of Casino Royale was filming in Venice and the most expensive film in history, Titanic, was about to premiere at the Venice Film Festival, as well as the Venice Film Festival itself, Venice was extremely lively. A large number of media, who were not very interested in the Venice Film Festival, came from all over the world because of these reasons. At the same time, Cameron was not alone. Katzenberg happened to be in France in the next few days to deal with some affairs at Disneyland Paris, so he came along. However, Katzenberg and Cameron did not have a good relationship. Both of them were hot-tempered and stubborn guys. Eric did not deliberately put the two of them together for the time being, as long as they did not fight. After all, there was no personal conflict between the two. One was for the company, and the other was for the film. Therefore, as long as the future box office performance of Titanic could meet expectations, Eric would come forward to mediate, and the grudge between the two would naturally be resolved. September 28th. As the opening film, the premiere of Titanic was scheduled at 7 p.m. local time. Eric attended the opening ceremony of the film festival during the day and made a brief appearance at the reception afterwards. He then left in a hurry to join the preparations for the premiere of Titanic. Just after 6 p.m., outside the Lido Palace, a large number of media reporters and fans had gathered on both sides of the long red carpet. It seemed to be livelier than the opening ceremony during the day. Although most of the management of Firefly Group was not very optimistic about Titanic, with the strong support of Eric, the company still invested a large amount of publicity budget for Titanic. In order to make the premiere more popular, everyone, including Eric, tried their best to contact the celebrity guests who could attend the premiere. In addition to most of the judges of the Venice Film Festival and all the creators of Titanic, there were also heavyweight Hollywood and European stars such as Liam Neeson, Dustin Hoffman, Pierce Brosnan, Nicolas Cage, Bridget Fonda, Holly Hunter, Sophie Marceau, Juliette Binoche. Even though many people were pessimistic about Titanic, when these guests appeared on the red carpet, they often caused screams from the fans and photos from the media reporters. As the host, Eric appeared with Katzenberg and Cameron at the beginning of the red carpet. The three of them walked across the red carpet. After taking photos in the media area, they answered a few questions and entered the palace to greet the guests who came to support them. "Hey, Liam, I'm glad you can come. I heard that the judges liked your Michael Collins very much this time. Good luck." "Oh, Bridget, you are still so beautiful. Of course, if there is a chance for the next movie, I will definitely work with you. Cage, I thought you might not be able to spare the time." After a series of greetings, Eric had just sent Nicolas Cage into the movie palace when Sophie Marceau, who was wearing a long black dress and looking lazy, walked over. Sophie didn't seem to have changed at all compared to a few years ago. She had a head of smooth black hair, watery eyes, and a delicate face. When she smiled, it made people feel comfortable. "Hi, Sophie, long time no see." Eric walked forward and extended his hands to the girl. After filming Braveheart, although Sophie had taken on a few more roles in Hollywood, the two had not seen each other many times. This time, Eric had only called her tentatively. He thought that the other party would reject him after not contacting him for a long time. He did not expect Sophie to agree. After gently hugging Eric, Sophie let go of him, but there was a faint dissatisfaction on her face. "Eric, I almost didn't want to talk to you." "Oh, can I know why?" Eric pretended to be shocked. Sophie rolled her eyes at him and said, "Do you still remember what you promised me?" Eric pretended to be puzzled. When he saw the girl wrinkling her nose angrily, he quickly said, "Okay, of course I remember. Bond girl. However, I'm really sorry, Sophie, the production strategy of the 007 series has been greatly adjusted. This sequel does not have the role of the villain, so you can only wait for the next one." "Okay, since you still remember this, I forgive you." Sophie waved her hand at him and then smiled sweetly. "I originally thought that you forgot all the nonsense you said to coax women." "Oh, it's really sad that you think so." Eric pretended to be hurt and said, "But, okay, this is actually my fault. I forgot to inform you in advance. So, can you give me a chance to apologize? I'm curious how you plan to apologize." Sophie glanced at him flirtatiously and added, "Mr. World's Richest Man, you can't be insincere." "No problem." Eric readily said, "I'll buy the Eiffel Tower tomorrow and get someone to send it to your house." Sophie's face was full of disdain. "I don't want second-hand goods." "Okay, then build a new one in your yard." "Hee hee." Sophie laughed happily. When she saw a few more guests appear at the entrance, she stopped joking and waved at Eric. "You continue to entertain the guests. I'll go in first." Eric nodded and said, "Let's eat together when you have time." Sophie nodded and said, "Okay, as long as you have time. I know you're a busy man. For a beauty like you, no matter how busy I am, I can find time." "Oh, sweet words." Sophie smiled and patted Eric lightly. Without saying anything else, she turned and walked inside. Eric looked away and greeted the guests again. This time, it was two fat men, the brothers Harvey Wayne Stan and Bob Stan. Shakespeare's Love, starring Daniel Day-Lewis and Julia, had finished filming and was now in post-production. This film was focused on the Oscars and had nothing to do with the Venice Film Festival. However, as a professional award winner, Mike Mira would definitely not miss the Venice Film Festival. This time, the film was called The Frivolous Years. It was a biopic of an American street artist. The cast was very strong, including David Bowie, Dennis Cooper, William Dafoe, Gary Oldman, and a large number of Hollywood stars. Although Titanic was the opening film, it was purely an exhibition film and would not compete for any awards at the Venice Film Festival. Therefore, many big names who came to participate in the film put aside their scruples and came to support, including the Wayne Stan brothers. After chatting with Harvey Wayne Stan for a while and greeting a few more guests, it was soon 7:00. Eric entered the screening room. Cameron brought Leonardo and several other main creators to the stage to give a simple speech, and the film officially began. The lights in the screening room dimmed. Eric looked at the big screen. Cameron quickly came out from backstage and sat next to him. After all, it was the first public appearance of Titanic. Although he looked quite relaxed on the surface, Eric still noticed Cameron's tight grip on the armrest. "Hey, Jim, relax. I guess everyone will like this film." "I hope so," Cameron muttered in a low voice. He then turned to Eric and raised his voice. "Anyway, Eric, thank you." Eric nodded slightly and did not say anything. He just patted Cameron on the shoulder. In the screening room, as the image on the big screen lit up, the 300 invited guests, reporters, and fans firmly locked their attention on the big screen. Everyone wanted to see what this movie, which cost an unprecedented $215 million, looked like. However, the opening scene of the treasure hunt in the deep sea disappointed most of the people. It seemed that there was nothing special about it. This feeling of disappointment lasted until the appearance of the aged Rose, and the memories began to unfold. When the gigantic figure of the Titanic appeared at the British Harbour, and the stunning appearance of the young Rose played by Rachel Weisz, the audience's disappointment was slightly alleviated. Those in the industry who were familiar with the filming process sighed in their hearts. Such a highly restored scene was indeed a money-burning weapon. However, they also couldn't help but secretly think, is it really necessary to create such extravagant and wasteful scenes for a movie? As the plot progressed, after a long period of foreshadowing, even the scene of Jack and Rose standing at the bow of the ship was like a dream to anyone who saw it. It was hard to stop the media and filmmakers from secretly positioning the film as a cliché love story between a princess and a coachman. Therefore, although the movie began to frequently enter tear-jerking mode in the second half, for many media reporters and filmmakers in the industry, the movie did not have many highlights except for some very exquisite special effects. It was not until the heavenly voice of the ending song, "My Heart Will Go On," that some people suddenly felt that it was probably the most attractive song in the entire movie. In fact, Eric had been paying attention to the reactions of the audience in the screening hall, mainly the small group of lucky ordinary audience members. When he noticed the two girls at the back left hugging each other and sobbing unabashedly at the last moment of Jack and Rose's farewell, Eric was probably relieved. The movie's main target audience was the young people, and the marketing plan that Firefly had formulated for Titanic was mainly aimed at this group of people. Eric was not too worried about the opinions of the film critics. As long as the media did not give a one-sided negative review, Titanic had a chance to create a miracle that had happened in the original spacetime. When the ending song ended, the lights in the screening hall lit up, and there was a burst of applause. It was not cold, but it was not too enthusiastic either. Many people were even whispering to their companions while clapping. The audience began to disperse. Eric waved his hand and asked his assistant, Peter Ritchie, who was sitting nearby, to come over. He said, "I forgot to ask in advance. Is there a survey for ordinary fans of this movie?" Peter Ritchie shook his head and said, "No, Mr. Williams, including tonight and tomorrow's 3 screenings, the tickets are mainly for media reporters and film critics. There are only 50 tickets for ordinary fans through the event." With only 50 ordinary audience members, it was understandable that the distribution department did not arrange a survey. There were only 4 screenings of Titanic at the Venice Film Festival. Because of the large number of media reporters from all over the world, the tickets for these 4 screenings could be said to be in short supply. There were very few tickets for ordinary audiences. Only 4 screenings were arranged mainly to narrow down the audience as much as possible so that it would be easier for Firefly to carry out post-production publicity operations. After all, it was a huge investment of more than $200 million. There was no harm in being careful. No matter how confident Eric was, he did not want to expand the number of screenings. 50 tickets it is. After thinking about it, Eric said, "Forget about tonight. Go and arrange it. No matter how many ordinary fans are left after tomorrow's screenings, I want to see the survey form for these people the day after tomorrow." Peter Ritchie did not ask anything else. He nodded and hurriedly left. Katzenberg, Cameron, and a few others stood not far away. When they saw Eric and his assistant finish talking, they walked over together. Katzenberg said, "Eric, let's go to the banquet hall. Everyone is already waiting there." Eric nodded and left with the others. They rushed to the banquet that the crew had specially organized for the guests. In the banquet hall of the Lido Island Hotel, Eric shuttled through the crowd, greeted the guests one by one, and chatted casually. After socializing for a full half an hour, he escaped to the balcony outside the banquet hall to get some fresh air. This was the 2nd floor of the hotel, facing the sea. Looking into the distance, it was the brightly lit main city of Venice. However, there was already someone on the balcony. She was wearing a long black dress, holding a glass of red wine in her hand. She leaned against the railing and quietly looked at the distant sky. Eric walked over and leaned against the railing to look at Sophie's side profile. He smiled and said, "The beauty is alone, and no one is hitting on her. What a waste." Sophie smiled reluctantly and said softly, "Eric, you're the 5th one. Also, I'm also hesitating. Do you want to be the 5th one to be chased away by me?" In the faint light, Eric noticed that Sophie's expression was obviously a little lonely. He asked, "Why are you suddenly unhappy?" Chapter 807. Sophie obviously did not want to talk about this topic. She shook her head and said, "It's nothing." Eric stared at Sophie's face for a moment and seemed to understand something. He suddenly laughed and said, "I thought that an actress who often stars in romance movies would not be interested in this kind of story." Although there were some particularly artistic movies, but starting from First Kiss, most of Sophie's movies were actually very fresh and romantic sketches. Sophie was a little dissatisfied with Eric's argument. She said, "You have also starred in romance movies. According to your point of view, if you have no feelings for this movie, how did you write, 'My heart will go on'?" "Oh, I didn't expect you to notice that I wrote the ending song. It's really an honor." Sophie rolled her eyes and decided to ignore Eric. Eric did not pester her. He quietly stood beside the woman and looked at the dark sky together, enjoying the rare peace. After a while, Sophie could not stand the silence and said, why aren't you talking? I'm thinking about something. How are you going to trick me into going back to the room tonight? Sophie looked at Eric's dumbfounded expression and finally smiled. She was a little proud of her successful prank, or perhaps it was a sense of victory after taking the initiative to turn the tables. Although it had been a long time, Sophie still clearly remembered that Eric had coaxed her into bed twice in a row. So tonight, she decided that she would not let this guy have his way again. Well, okay, although after watching Titanic, she suddenly wanted to find a hug to lean on. However, Sophie glanced at Eric and thought in her heart, I'm not that easy to coax. However, noticing the sly look in Sophie's eyes, Eric did not say anything but chose to do something. So he put the wine glass aside and reached out to Sophie. You. Sophie suddenly realized that things didn't seem to be going according to plan. Shouldn't he be saying some sweet nothings next? Why was it suddenly like this? Her little head buzzed twice before Sophie finally reacted. She raised her arm that was holding the glass of red wine to the side and said in a trembling voice, Eric, the red wine is going to spill on me. Oh, you. After a long pause, Sophie said the second half of her sentence, bad guy. At that time, after a long time, waking up in the same man's arms for the third time, Sophie could not help but think about a very deep question. Why was it like this? Maybe it was because when he was sleeping, he would always hug the woman beside him tightly, giving her a sense of security. Maybe it was because he had many identities mixed together, making women instinctively difficult to resist. Or maybe, this abominable guy was a legendary wizard, and cast some mysterious witchcraft on her. Feeling the big hand around her waist began to gently stroke, Sophie realized that Eric was awake, so she took the initiative to turn around. Her bright eyes met with Eric's. Eric leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. Noticing the doubt and curiosity in Sophie's eyes, a smile appeared on his face. He lowered his voice and mysteriously said, Actually, I know a guy called Cupid. When I take a fancy to a girl, he will shoot an arrow at her, and then the girl will never be able to escape from my grasp. Sophie's big eyes quickly blinked a few times and laughed. She suddenly understood that this guy in front of her was not a wizard, nor was he anything else. He was just too good at seeing through a woman's thoughts. She was originally a very emotional woman. When she watched the movie last night, she did not have any thoughts of being a filmmaker. She purely thought of herself as a spectator, so she was moved by the actually very simple love story. When she recalled the experience of these years, she could not help but feel melancholy. So, at this moment when her heart was weak, a certain guy easily took advantage of it. Eric, I think, you can't do this in the future. Who knows what will happen in the future? Eric leaned over and kissed Sophie's lips again. Sophie subconsciously responded. After a moment, the two separated. Sophie sat up and began to put on her clothes. Eric looked at Sophie and said, You're not going to leave like this again, right? Sophie picked up Eric's watch on the bedside table and looked at it. It was 8:15. Although she was looking forward to it, she did not have time to stay and eat breakfast with Eric. Sophie put down the watch and said, Yes, I made an appointment with someone. It's 9:00. We're going to talk about a movie contract at the Palace Hotel. Seeing Eric's disappointed face, Sophie felt a little proud of herself and said, Otherwise, do you think I'll come all the way to Venice just for you? Eric lay on the bed and covered his forehead. He said, You're really heartless. Shouldn't a good woman take care of a man's vanity? Haha. Sophie smiled and put on her clothes. She leaned over and kissed Eric's face. She said, If I were a good woman, would I be so easily tricked into bed with you? Bad guy, I'm leaving. Eric watched Sophie go into the bathroom, wash up, and push the door open to leave. Only then did he get up. He still had a lot of work to do. Based on the time difference, the article about Titanic in North America should be published at noon. However, the media in Europe must have already started to report it. In addition to paying attention to the media's feedback on Titanic, he also needed to talk to Katzenberg about Clover Holdings. The contract for The Matrix was about to be signed. After receiving the $300 million, Eric hoped to invest as soon as possible. In addition, FFM was about to go online in mid-September. He also needed to talk to Harvey Wayne and Stan about the online platform. In addition to some unavoidable social engagements, Eric's schedule had to be calculated by the minute. When he got up and went to the dining room, Katzenberg and Cameron were already waiting there. There were several newspapers on the table in front of them, but their expressions were not so relaxed. "Morning, Jeffrey, Jim," Eric greeted them and sat down in the empty seat next to them. "Morning, Eric." Katzenberg glanced at Cameron and pushed the newspapers in front of him over. He said, "Take a look first. The reviews in Europe don't seem to be very good." Eric opened the newspaper on the top. The newspaper was in Italian. Eric did not know the name of the newspaper. The news about Titanic in the newspaper was specially marked with a red pen. There was also a sticky note filled with English translations next to it. A cliché love story set in a disaster movie. Although the film has some highlights in special effects, shots, soundtrack, etc., it's mediocre overall. Eric frowned slightly and opened the next newspaper. He directly found the English translation. This time, it was a compliment. "James Cameron brought us a grand disaster movie. The film's narrative is smooth, the structure is rigorous, and the special effects are exquisite. The love story set in a disaster is even more tear-jerking." After flipping through several newspapers, Eric also found that the reviews of the movie seemed to be a bit polarized. Some said it was very good, and some said it was very bad. After reading the articles, Eric looked up at Katzenberg and Cameron and smiled. "Let's wait for the news from North America. You know the European media. They like more artistic films. Here, let's have breakfast first." As he spoke, Eric casually waved for the waiter to come over and asked the two solemn-looking fellows what they wanted to eat. After breakfast, Cameron left to work on the 3 screenings of Titanic today. Eric talked to Katzenberg about Clover Holdings. "I hope that in the next 5 years, Firefly Group will take out at least $1 billion a year for external investment, mainly in the internet industry that has been rapidly rising in recent years. Of course, to be on the safe side, we will only invest in equity and not participate in the operations of the corresponding companies." Katzenberg patiently waited for Eric to finish. He took a sip of coffee and said, "Eric, in this case, the company's profitability will be greatly reduced. This is a bit unfair to me." Katzenberg's employment contract with Firefly had a fixed annual salary of $750,000. In addition, Katzenberg also enjoyed an annual bonus of 2% of the group's operating profits. If it were other Hollywood film companies, the annual return of this contract might be $10 to $20 million at most. However, because of Firefly's profitability in recent years, Katzenberg's total salary last year exceeded $50 million. He was one of the highest-paid group CEOs in North America. However, if they followed Eric's investment plan, Firefly's profitability would be greatly reduced, and Katzenberg's annual salary would also be greatly reduced. It might even be reduced to less than half of what it used to be. Of course, Katzenberg knew that Eric's purpose was to reduce the tax loss in the investment process. He believed that Eric would give him a satisfactory solution. Therefore, after listening to Eric's plan, he did not show any excitement and expressed his thoughts calmly. Eric propped up his hands on the table and looked at Katzenberg. "Jeffrey, your contract will expire at the beginning of next year. We've been working well together for the past few years, so I don't think there's any problem with us renewing our contract." Katzenberg nodded with a smile. "Of course. I guess you must know my investment intention. The Nasdaq index has risen from more than 700 points last year to 955 points now. It is just around the corner to break through 1,000 points. Everyone says that the Nasdaq index is a bit inflated, but I am very optimistic about the trend of the Nasdaq index. However, there are definitely risks in this. Even Buffett does not dare to make any judgment about the stock market, so I can give you 2 options." Katzenberg showed a look of curiosity. Eric paused for a moment before continuing, "Your contract remains unchanged. It's still a 2% annual profit bonus, but there are 2 ways to calculate it. First, We can make a separate remark and include the funds invested in Clover Holdings in your bonus calculation rules. You don't have to bear the investment risk of Clover Holdings. Of course, if there is any profit, you won't be able to enjoy the bonus. Second, because we are investing in equity, as long as we reach a suitable rate of return, the company will sell the shares it holds. Therefore, you can give up the bonus share of the investment in Clover Holdings. Then, our remark clause will be changed to that during your tenure as the CEO of Firefly, as long as the corresponding shares are sold, you will still be entitled to a bonus of 2% of the income from this investment, regardless of whether you are still employed or not. Katzenberg thought for a moment and asked, Eric, can I know which companies you plan to invest in? Cisco, AOL, Microsoft, Intel, IBM, Verizon, Sprint. Eric listed a few companies and said, I will make a special list because the amount of funds invested by our company is too large. It is impossible to buy a company's shares. Eric listed the popular IT and communications companies in recent years. Katzenberg had watched Yahoo, Cisco, AOL, and other companies that Firefly invested in reach the peak step by step. However, he also knew that the current price-to-earnings ratio of these high-tech companies was terrifyingly high. The higher the price-to-earnings ratio, the more optimistic the market was about the development of these companies, but it also meant that the risk of investing in these companies was very high. After hesitating for a while, Katzenberg looked at Eric and asked with a smile, Eric, which plan do you suggest I choose? Eric smiled and said, the second one, of course. Eric had discussed the salary of the company's CEO with Tina Brown and the others a few years ago. If a manager could only bring the company $10 million in profits a year, Eric would definitely not be willing to pay him $10 million. However, if a manager could bring the company billions of USD in annual profits, it was understandable even if the manager's annual salary was over $100 million. Katzenberg was undoubtedly a very capable manager. Although the rapid development of Firefly in recent years was due to Eric's personal cheat, it was also inseparable from Katzenberg's excellent management ability. Therefore, Eric did not mind Katzenberg's participation and sharing the dividends of the internet boom in the next few years. Katzenberg stared at Eric's expression for a few seconds, then smiled like a chinchilla and said, okay, the second one. Katzenberg also understood that with his current annual income, even if it was reduced by half, it was enough to support the most luxurious life in the world. Therefore, choosing the second contract could also be regarded as an investment for the future. He was also not worried that Clover Holdings would hold on to a stock for a long time after investing in it. That was because this would prove the value of certain stocks as an investment. Even after 10 or 20 years, or even longer, the earnings would be treated as a pension for themselves. Chapter 808. At noon, the reviews of Titanic from North America arrived in Venice one after another. Compared to Europe, Eric and the Firefly executives were more concerned about the North American media's evaluation of the movie. After all, Titanic was often released in the North American market before the overseas market. Its box office performance in the North American market had a large impact on the overseas market. However, the media reviews of Titanic in North America were not optimistic either. Although there was no lack of newspapers such as USA Today, the New York Times, and the Hollywood Reporter praising the film, the New York Times even praised it as a masterpiece comparable to Gone with the Wind. But at the same time, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and other newspapers did not hide their criticism of the movie, calling it a lousy movie with a mediocre story and a long plot. The Los Angeles Times even publicly questioned whether the movie was really worth $215 million. Eric only remembered the limitless success of Titanic in his previous life after it was released. As for the experience of the movie before it was released, it was mostly limited to Cameron's bumpy production stage. That was the result of media reports. As for the reputation of Titanic before it was released, Eric did not know much about it. Therefore, when he saw that the movie had a polarized reputation in Europe and North America at the same time, he could not help but feel nervous. In Eric's memory, there were many movies with a polarized reputation. These types of movies often had a common characteristic, which was that they were fan movies adapted from original works such as novels and comics. Moreover, The box office of such movies was basically high in the early stages due to the strong promotion of the movie company, but it was seriously lacking in the long run. In any case, Titanic was definitely not a fan movie. Therefore, with the current polarized reputation, the future was even more unpredictable. After all, fan movies could still rely on the popularity accumulated by the original work to earn a large box office a few weeks before it was released. Even if it was lacking in the long run, the total box office would not be too bad. However, Titanic did not have such an advantage. It was impossible for it to get a high box office like a fan film in the first few weeks of its release. Once the reputation of the film was still polarized in the later stages, the cumulative box office would definitely be much worse than a fan film in the case of insufficient momentum. The next day, Peter Ritchie sent the questionnaires from the dozens of ordinary movie fans who attended the screening to Eric. Most of the audience gave positive comments about Titanic, but there were also a few who complained that the film was too long and that the prelude was a little bloated. July 29th. Afternoon. Eric was about to fly to London at 7 o'clock in the evening. This was the last meeting of the Titanic crew. It was confirmed that the film would be released on December 20th during the Christmas season. The public publicity had already announced this date, so there was no possibility of changing it again. At this time, Eric, Katzenberg, James Cameron, and several other middle-level managers of the Firefly Group were sitting in the living room of Eric's suite at the Lido Island Hotel. The current situation is indeed not very good. However, I hope that you will follow the established publicity strategy and focus on the publicity for the younger audience. As he said this, Eric looked at Katzenberg and the other executives. He recalled some details in the original spacetime and added, "One more thing. No matter what the outside world says about Titanic, I don't want Firefly to have voices that undermine themselves. If I find out that any executive has expressed anything to the media, then he can just wait to pack up and leave. That's all I have to say. Does anyone have any opinions?" "Mr. Williams, it's like this." A high-ranking conduit in the distribution department said, "Yesterday, I received a call from an executive of Toho International in Japan. They hope to buy the Japanese distribution rights of Titanic in advance, including the theatrical distribution, videotapes, DVDs, and other peripherals." Eric raised his eyebrows slightly. The executive thought that Eric did not know about Toho International, so he said, "Toho International is one of the major distributors in Japan." "I know that." Eric nodded. Even though he was a little nervous now, he definitely did not intend to sell the departure rights in advance like Fox did in his previous life. However, Eric still asked curiously, "How much are they asking for?" 3 billion yen. The executive looked down at the memo and said, "About $25 million US." When Katzenberg heard the other party's offer, he started calculating quickly in his heart. Because of the Terminator series, Cameron was very popular in Japan. This was probably one of the reasons why Toho International had their eyes on Titanic in advance. In addition, the high budget of Titanic and the current situation of polarization were also the main reasons why the Japanese had made a move. They obviously wanted to take a gamble and judged that Firefly was likely to accept this bet. $25 million US was definitely just a preliminary offer. The Japanese's price should be about $30 million US. Because they were buying the full distribution rights in Japan, according to the expected price of $30 million US, the Japanese expected the local box office to be about $60 million US. Only then could they guarantee that they would fully recover their costs and achieve profits in the later stages. $60 million US in Japanese box office. Although it could not reach the $120 million US of Jurassic Park, it would definitely exceed the average box office value of Hollywood blockbusters in Japan. Moreover, for a Hollywood distribution company, according to the 35% overseas share, if they wanted to recover $30 million US in box office in Japan, they would need about $100 million US in Japanese box office. Of course, this did not include the revenue from the videotapes in Japan. However, the peripheral copyright operation cycle in the overseas market was even longer than that in the United States. If they calculated the time cost, it was still very cost-effective to sell all the Japanese distribution rights in one go. After quickly sorting out his thoughts, Katzenberg said, "Eric, I think maybe we can consider it. We should be able to negotiate about $30 million in the end. No. After a brief silence, Eric shook his head and said, "Not selling. Everyone, if there are other parties that want to buy the distribution rights of Titanic, reject them all." Seeing the puzzled look on everyone's face, Eric spread his hands and said, "That's it. Maybe you want to explain, but I don't know how to explain. I'm not selling. Since we're already at this point, regardless of whether we win or lose, let's go all out." The other executives were a little stunned. Cameron, who had been silent all this time, looked a little excited. Katzenberg shook his head with a bitter smile. It was rare to see such a childish and willful side of Eric. He was still young after all. However, it was true that since they were already at this point, it was impossible to recover the cost by selling the distribution rights in advance. Instead, it would only attract some people who wanted to take advantage of the situation, and this kind of behavior would make the media look even worse. Then, no matter the outcome, let's go all out. Anyway, Firefly Group could afford this kind of failure. This failure could also be planned to reform the company's slightly radical production strategy. At that time, Eric would no longer object. After the afternoon meeting, Eric flew to London, Katzenberg went to Paris, and Cameron would return to Los Angeles with the crew of Titanic and the staff of Firefly's distribution department tomorrow to start the official publicity work of Titanic. They took off from Venice at 7 o'clock in the evening. 2 hours later, the private business plane landed at London's Heathrow Airport. Eric got off the plane with the last group of people, and the first feeling he felt was cold. Venice was still as warm as spring at this time, but in London at the end of August and the beginning of September, the temperature at night had dropped to about 10 degrees. Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson, producers of the 007 series, came to pick them up. They exchanged greetings and drove together to Pinewood Studio, which was not far from Heathrow Airport. Speaking of the 007 series, in addition to the Broccoli family, who created this legendary agent movie series, Pinewood Studio, located in the northwest suburbs of London, England, had to be mentioned. Since the first No in 1963, most of the interior scenes of 007 sequels were shot at Pinewood Studio. The 007 series also became the main source of income for Pinewood Studio, allowing it to survive the impact of factors such as the rise of the television industry and the decline of European films. Because of the great significance of the 007 series to the studio, in addition to the iconic 007 studio, there were many buildings named after 007 elements in Pinewood Studio. Several main roads in the park were basically contracted by the 007 series, namely Broccoli Avenue, 007 Avenue, and Goldfinger Avenue. That night, they settled down in a small town close to the east of Pinewood Studio. The next morning, the Broccoli siblings took Eric to the studio park. There were no shooting plans today. Eric mainly wanted to familiarize himself with the shooting site for the next 2 months. After taking Eric around the 30-hectare park and checking several sets arranged in advance for Casino Royale, Barbara Broccoli said, "In the next 2 months, the temperature in London will get colder and colder, so we have scheduled the underwater scene between Bond and Vesper for 3 days later. Eric, let's go to the water tank first." Pinewood Studio had the largest underwater filming facility in Europe, which could hold 1,200 tons of water. It was also built specifically for the 007 series. Eric retained the underwater farewell scene between Bond and Vesper after the building collapsed in Venice in the original version. However, this scene would definitely not be shot in Venice. Instead, it would be moved to the underwater studio in Pinewood Studio. Eric nodded and followed the Broccoli siblings to a studio. At first glance, the studio looked like a huge indoor swimming pool, but in fact, it was not. If it was just a simple indoor pool, any studio in the world could do it. The biggest advantage of Pinewood Studio's underwater studio was that it had a complete set of underwater filming equipment and plans. Anyone who had made a movie before knew that regardless of whether it was filmed on water or underwater, as long as there was water involved, the difficulty of filming would greatly increase. Just like Cameron's Abyss, Kevin Costner's future Waterworld, and the recently completed Titanic, the reason why these movies were so expensive was that they involved water-related filming. Although the crew was still on break today, several staff members of Casino Royale were still busy in the underwater studio. Eric also saw his exclusive cameraman, Nick Frank, standing by the pool in a wet diving suit and discussing something with another person who was also wearing a diving suit. Seeing Eric and the Broccoli siblings appear, everyone greeted them. Nick also came over with another person. After greeting them, he introduced them. Eric, this is David Reese, the underwater cameraman of Pinewood Studio. Hello, Mr. Reese. I may have to trouble you for the next few days. Eric smiled and shook hands with him. After all these years of experience, although Nick was already one of the top cameramen in Hollywood, he had never been involved in underwater filming. Therefore, to a large extent, he had to rely on the professional underwater cameraman in Pinewood Studio to help with this shoot. David Reese shook hands with Eric and said with a smile, Mr. Williams, it's my honor to work with you. Eric walked to the pool and reached out to test the temperature of the water. He said, the temperature is relatively low now. What's the water temperature here? About 20 degrees, the same as the room temperature. David Reese took the initiative to explain. However, during the shoot, we can turn on the warm water circulation system to control the water temperature to a more suitable temperature. Eric narrowed his eyes and looked at the bottom of the water. He did not see the bottom of the water tank, so he asked, what about the depth of the water? This is the deep water area. The depth is 6 meters, David Reese said. Because the iron cage is more than 2 meters deep, in order to avoid being exposed, the underwater set of Casino Royale is mainly in this area. The two chatted for a while. Then, Nick said, Eric, we have finished the underwater set. Do you want to go down and take a look? Eric nodded. David Reese took the initiative to take Eric to the changing room. After changing into a diving suit, Nick and David Reese explained to him again. Then, the three of them slowly went into the water. The surroundings were cold. Eric's physical fitness was good, so he slowly adapted to it after a while. Although it looked deep from the surface of the water, when they dived into the water, with some light, they could roughly see the surrounding scene. The surrounding set was set according to the wreckage of the collapsed building in Venice. When they came to the set area, there were very realistic broken walls and debris scattered everywhere. It was as if a building had really just sunk to the bottom of the water. Nick and David Reese took Eric to the bottom of the water for a few minutes. Then, they dived out of the water and discussed some details together. Eric was about to ask David Reese to bring the underwater camera to test the underwater shooting effect when his assistant, Peter Ritchie, walked over from not far away and gestured to Eric with his phone. Everyone, wait a moment. I may have to take a call, Eric said. He climbed down the ladder and got out of the pool. He took a big towel from a staff member and simply wiped the water on his body. Then, he walked to Peter Ritchie. Chapter 809. The call was from Kelly, who was in Los Angeles. It turned out that it was about the MP3 player. Firefly Electronics R&D Center in San Francisco had finally produced a finished product of the MP3 player that used microdisc technology as the storage medium. Eric talked to Kelly for a while and finally said, then, get someone to send the sample to London. I'll take a look at it. Let the electronics company and Yahoo come up with a suitable plan for the specific sales and promotion plan. About the music copyright? Eric hesitated and said, Sony Records will definitely not give us the rights easily. Other than the group's own music resources, we can focus on negotiating with Warner Records and Universal Records. Let Yahoo do the work first. I'll go back to Los Angeles in November and see the situation. Oh, Carolyn, since she's going back to London for a vacation, let her bring the sample over. Well, that's it. Goodbye. After hanging up the phone, Eric stood there and thought. In order to promote MP3 players, the most important thing was to solve the problem of music copyright. Sony had spent a huge sum of money to buy Columbia Records and other music companies to promote their Walkman. They merged all of these companies and formed the current Sony Records. After poaching the team under Jive Records to Firefly Records had also launched a group of very popular teen pop singers such as the Backstreet Boys in the past 2 years. They also had the rights to distribute the soundtracks of all the movies under the Firefly Group. However, the overall strength of Firefly Records was still a far cry from the veteran music giants such as Sony Records and Warner Records, especially the music copyright library. Compared to the veteran music giants who easily owned millions of song copyrights, Firefly Records only had a few tens of thousands of songs. It was not even worth mentioning and could not support the Yahoo Music Store plan. Eric did not tie the MP3 player and the Yahoo Music Store together. The two products belonged to Firefly Electronics and Yahoo Network Company, respectively. He wanted to turn the Yahoo Music Store into a monopolistic online music sales platform. Firefly Electronics did not plan to firmly control the patent of the MP3 player. At this time, Nokia had already obtained all the technical authorization and set up a Nokia Music mobile phone R&D department. In the future, the MP3 player would also be licensed to more stakeholders of Firefly Electronics. Eric's plan was that all companies that obtained MP3 player patents in the future could only buy music records from a Yahoo Music Store. After all, the MP3 player was only a transitional product with a relatively short period of popularity, but the Yahoo Music Store could operate for a long time. Once users were used to buying music from this store, even if electronic hardware products were rapidly upgraded, the Yahoo Music Store could still maintain a strong position in the industry and bring in rich profits in the long run. After a short day of recuperation and familiarizing themselves with the filming environment of Pineland Studio, the crew began operations again the next day. Most of the exterior scenes had been filmed in the Bahamas, Czech Republic, and Italy. The last 2 months of filming were basically completed in Pineland Studio. Pineland Studio was also the first filming base in Europe to undergo digital transformation. While filming, the film had also begun preliminary post-production work in Pineland Studio. It was always difficult to encounter good weather in London. It was drizzling outside the car window. Carolyn Wilson returned to London yesterday evening and drove to Pineland Studio early in the morning. The Wilson family's manor was located in the western suburbs of London on the banks of the Thames River. It was only 10 kilometers away from Pineland Studio. Carolyn drove very slowly, but it took less than 20 minutes. The sapphire blue Mini women's car left the highway and turned onto Pineland Road. It went all the way north and soon arrived outside Pineland Studio. After parking the car in the parking lot, Carolyn picked up a small suitcase from the front passenger seat. She closed the car door and opened an umbrella. After hesitating for a moment, she carefully bent down and tidied up her fluffy blonde hair. Only then did she walk into the park. As it wasn't far from her home, Carolyn had been to Pineland Studio more than once in the past. She knew the layout of the park like the back of her hand. Pineland Studio's iconic 007 studio was located in the northernmost part of the park. It was also the largest studio in the studio. However, when she called last night, she found out that today's filming wouldn't take place in 007 Studio. Instead, it would take place at the underwater filming base. She was familiar with the place and found the studio where the underwater filming base was located. When the security guard at the entrance of the studio saw a petite blonde girl walking over with a suitcase, he was curious. However, it was difficult for him to raise his guard. He took the initiative to ask, "This, Miss, may I ask who you are looking for?" "Sir, my name is Carolyn Wilson. I have an appointment with you," Carolyn said politely to the security guard as she put away her umbrella. The security guard was a slightly plump middle-aged uncle in his 40s. Perhaps it was because he rarely heard people address him as sir. Coupled with the aristocratic aura that Carolyn exuded, he couldn't help but feel a little more respectful towards her. He nodded with a smile and said, "Miss, please wait a moment. Let me ask." A moment later, Peter Ritchie walked out of the studio and said, "Carolyn, it's so nice to see you again. Come with me." Carolyn followed Peter Ritchie with her suitcase and asked, Is Mr. Williams inside?" Everyone in Eric's office knew about Carolyn's feelings for Eric. When Peter Ritchie heard Carolyn deliberately change the way she addressed him, he smiled and nodded. "Of course. However, everyone is very busy. You might have to wait until noon. Actually, you could have come at noon. I don't have anything to do at home. Why don't I come over earlier? Carolyn explained with a slightly red face. She carefully glanced at Peter Ritchie, somewhat worried that he would tease her. Peter Ritchie naturally wouldn't do that. He casually changed the topic and brought Carolyn to the studio. There was a pool in the middle, with roughly 40 to 50 people busy around it. There were even a few large green screens set up by the pool. There were clearly people working in the water. The studio wasn't noisy at all. Other than the occasional sounds of props being moved and the executive director shouting with a megaphone, everything seemed to be in order. When they arrived at an empty space in the periphery, Peter Ritchie pointed to the surroundings and said, "We can only wait here." There were a few simple chairs, a few large towels, and a long table with a steaming coffee pot on it. This should be the resting area. Two middle-aged men were currently wrapped in large towels, drinking hot coffee as they chatted. Noticing Peter Ritchie walking over with a petite little girl, they couldn't help but take a few more glances at Carolyn, before nodding slightly in greeting. Carolyn politely returned a glance. She swept her gaze around the studio, but didn't see Eric's figure. She couldn't help but look at Peter Ritchie in confusion. Peter Ritchie smiled and pointed to the water. Carolyn seemed to have understood something. Just as she turned her head to look, a few splashing sounds came from the center of the pool. 5 or 6 people floated up from the bottom of the pool. Although Eric was wearing a diving suit, Carolyn still noticed him at a glance. She subconsciously raised her left hand, but didn't raise it. This was because Eric wasn't looking at her. Instead, he said a few words to the staff by the pool. Some of the people waiting by the pool jumped into the water and pulled a few people out of the water. Peter Ritchie brought a cup of coffee over and invited Carolyn to sit down. He handed the coffee over and said, "Today's filming has only started for an hour. It will probably take until noon. Carolyn, if you're bored, perhaps you can take a walk in the park. There's a cinema on Golden Finger Avenue." Carolyn placed the suitcase on her knees and took the coffee from Peter Ritchie. She thanked him and said, "It's okay. I'll just wait here." Peter Ritchie nodded. He looked at the suitcase on Carolyn's knees and asked, "Do you need me to help you put it away?" Carolyn shook her head and said, "No, thank you." Peter Ritchie knew what was in the suitcase, so he didn't force her. When he saw Carolyn looking at the filming location, he took the initiative to explain, "The filming here has been going on for 3 days. It should be done today. The underwater scenes are very difficult to control. Mr. Williams has been going down personally for the past few days. The day before yesterday, we were filming a scene where an iron cage fell into the water and almost injured someone." Carolyn felt her little heart skip a beat. She asked, "Is everyone all right?" "Of course it's fine. There are lifeguards under the water at all times. However, the weather is a little cold now, and a few people in the crew have caught a cold." Speaking of this, Peter Ritchie smiled and said, "A few lucky guys. In order to avoid catching a cold, they were given a few days off. I heard that they slipped away to London before dawn this morning." "Haha." Carolyn giggled. "What about you?" Peter Ritchie asked, "How long will you be on leave this time?" "A month." "Half a month," Carolyn said. "I have to return to Los Angeles on the 20th. If I rest for too long, I might fall behind in a lot of work." Ever since The Matrix was released, many people in the Firefly system felt that the staff in Eric's assistant office were very similar to Agent Smith in The Matrix. They didn't directly participate in any of the business activities of the companies in the Firefly system, but they would collect and sort out any important operational information of these companies. They would then make a corresponding professional evaluation and submit it to Eric. Therefore, they could be said to be the eyes of Eric in controlling the Firefly economic empire. After several years of exploration, Eric's assistant office had formed a very fixed and effective working model. Although in the eyes of many people, the existence of this department was very weak, with the rapid expansion of the Firefly economic empire, everyone in the office was actually very busy every day. Assistants like Peter Ritchie, who were able to follow Eric, were more relaxed. After Carolyn finished speaking, Peter Ritchie couldn't help but look at the pool. He smiled and said, "Mr. Williams and I have talked. Next year, I might be working at FFM TV station." FFM TV station was the major fee-paying channel project of Firefly, MGM, and Fox in the next few years. From the public information, Carolyn could feel the importance Eric attached to this TV station. When she heard Peter Ritchie say this, of course, Carolyn knew that he was going to be promoted. She said, "Congratulations, Peter." Because Peter Ritchie had been by Eric's side for the past half of the year, he knew better than Carolyn how much Eric expected of FFM TV station. Of course, if he were to become a middle manager of FFM TV station, it would be a very high and promising start for his career. However, he smiled and said, "Carolyn, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that if I transfer next year, Mr. Williams might need a new assistant. You know that Ms. Haynes can't stay by Mr. Williams' side for a long time. Maybe you can fight for it." Carolyn's small face flushed red. She stuttered, Mr. Williams will definitely have to make the decision himself." Carolyn's warm, polite, and kind personality made almost all the employees in the assistant office treat her like a little sister. Coupled with the fact that she was a British aristocrat, everyone felt that if there was anyone who was good enough for her, it would be their boss. After being by Eric's side for half a year, Peter Ritchie had a rough understanding of Eric's personality. Although his boss was a playboy, he was a man who was very considerate of the feelings of the women around him. In other words, if Carolyn could stay by his side, Peter Ritchie was sure that with his boss's personality, he would definitely restrain himself when it came to women. Perhaps, Carolyn would slowly become the official boss's wife. However, looking at Carolyn's blushing face, Peter Ritchie only smiled and didn't say anything. After all, no matter how much he liked the girl beside him, he would never reveal that he was trying to figure out his boss's personality. This was an unspoken rule that everyone in the workplace did, but no one would take the initiative to announce it. No boss liked their employees trying to figure them out all the time. If it was revealed, they might lose their jobs. At the filming location in the pool, Eric noticed Carolyn's figure not long after she arrived. However, he didn't have the time to greet her. It was already the fourth day of filming the underwater farewell scene between Bond and Vesper. The thrilling scenes of the iron cage and Vesper falling into the water had already been filmed. There were only a few scenes left. However, these scenes were one of the most important twists in Eric's film. With Vesper's death, Bond had completed his transformation. He had once again transformed into the cold-blooded top-notch Agent 007 and started his journey of revenge. With the sound of splashing water, a group of people once again surfaced from the bottom of the water. Eric took off his diving goggles and breathing apparatus. This time, he didn't ask anyone to pull them ashore. He only asked the cameraman to go up and change the film for the underwater camera. Then, he waved to Pierce Brosnan and Cate Blanchett, who had quickly put on 2 life buoys nearby. When they gathered around, he said, "Pierce, let's change the effect." Bond doesn't know why Vesper suddenly betrayed him, so what you have to show now is a pure and calm expression. You want to save Vesper first and ask him why. Pierce Brosnan thought for a moment and asked tentatively, "In other words, I don't need to make too many expressions?" He could feel that Eric didn't have much hope for him anymore, so he made such a simple request. In the scene just now, Vesper had sunk into the water with the iron cage. When she saw Bond diving into the water to save her, she was sad and reluctant, but there was also a determination to die. She was a stubborn and paranoid woman. She knew that she had messed up everything. Not only did she not save her sister, but she also lost the $150 million. She also let down the man who loved her deeply. So, she only wanted to die. Bond couldn't understand Vesper's determination to die. He didn't understand the ins and outs of the matter for the time being. In the process of breaking out of the cage, he was anxious and angry. He just wanted to save this woman first and then figure everything out. Unfortunately, Vesper didn't cooperate with him. Cate was indeed Aunt May's successor in the original spacetime. Even though it was her first time shooting an underwater scene, she still perfectly achieved the performance Eric wanted. But when it came to Pierce Brosnan, the scene was shot 7 times in a row, and the results were not satisfactory. When Eric heard Pierce Brosnan's words, he nodded helplessly. This handsome British actor really didn't have the talent to show the character's emotions through facial expressions, let alone underwater. He had tried so many times and could only give up and lower his requirements. As the two were discussing, Kate floated on the surface of the water. She took a few sips of hot coffee from the staff and looked at the two of them. She carefully interjected, "Eric, can I say what I think?" Eric smiled and nodded. "Of course." He didn't notice the difference in his tone when talking to Pierce and Kate, but it should be the same as the teacher's attitude towards the top and bottom students in school. Kate handed the coffee cup back to the staff and said, "I think that Pierce can stare at me when shooting, just like this." As she said that, Kate gathered her thoughts and restrained the expression on her face. She pursed her lips and looked at Eric with a determined gaze. Perhaps she was instantly immersed in the role, for Kate even reached out to grab the life buoy in front of Eric, as if she wanted to forcibly pull open a non-existent cage door. For a moment, Eric felt that if he didn't let go of the life buoy in front of him, Kate would tear him apart. He hurriedly let go, and Kate didn't hesitate to pull the life buoy in front of him. Although Kate didn't show much expression, her simple but determined gaze made Eric feel a sense of urgency, desperation, and fear. "Woman, get out here, I won't let you die." I've mixed up the words. Eric immediately threw away the messy thoughts that suddenly came to mind and said excitedly to Pierce Brosnan, "Pierce, did you see that? Just like this." Chapter 8:10. Britain's labor protection laws were much stricter than North America's. Even the slightest violation of the working schedule could lead to an investigation by the union. At noon, the crew stopped work for lunch. Eric instructed Peter Ritchie to prepare 2 lunches, then took Carolyn to the exclusive office of the 007 crew in the administrative district. Carrying the small suitcase for Carolyn, Eric looked at the girl beside him and asked, "I saw you come so early in the morning. Don't tell me your house is nearby?" Carolyn felt a little uncomfortable following Eric around empty-handed, but she was too embarrassed to ask for the suitcase back. From time to time, she raised her face to look at Eric beside her and nodded. "Yes, it's by the Tame River." Carolyn was obviously used to the location of her home, but Eric didn't know where the Tame River was. However, it should be very close, so he didn't ask too much. He asked, "How are your parents?" "Very good, but Dad is still very busy, just like you. My brothers are also very busy. Mom is often alone at home." Eric smiled and said, "Since that's the case, you can spend more time with your mother during this period." Carolyn nodded obediently. "I will." The two soon arrived at the temporary office. Carolyn opened the small suitcase with a password. Inside, there were 3 rectangular boxes neatly arranged. Eric opened the box, and an MP3 player slightly larger than an old-fashioned lighter appeared in front of him. It had a beautiful sky blue shell, a circular wheel operating interface, and a pure white display screen. In addition to the player, the box also came with headphones, a charger, a data cable, and other accessories. Seeing Eric skillfully turn on the device and casually turn on the computer on the desktop, Carolyn whispered, "This is the latest product from the R&D center. It uses a 512M microdrive and a rechargeable lithium battery. The display screen is made of the latest generation of TFT. It can play for 8 hours on a single charge. The data is transmitted using a USB cable." Eric tried a few simple operations. A few songs were stored in the player in advance. When he put on the headphones, pleasant music came out. Eric took out another box from the suitcase and handed it to Carolyn. "You try it too." "Can I?" Carolyn asked with uncertainty. Seeing that Eric had already handed it to her, the girl received it and carefully opened it. Although she had brought these 3 samples all the way from Los Angeles, due to her good upbringing, Carolyn didn't open them in advance despite her curiosity. The one in her hand just so happened to be pink in color. Carolyn knew that the last one should be pure white. The Research and Development Center had finally confirmed the final product of the MP3 player. There were a total of 3 colors: sky blue, pure white, and pink. Carolyn had been following up on Firefly Electronics information, but this was her first time using an MP3 player. She wasn't as familiar with it as Eric, who still needed to read the manual before using it. Eric looked at the girl clumsily fiddling with the MP3 player in her hand and smiled. He saw that the computer on the table was already turned on and connected to the internet. Yahoo had started to venture overseas in the past 2 years. Currently, Yahoo had branches in major English-speaking countries, Japan, Germany, and France. They had also started to operate portals, Yahoo Mail, instant messaging, and other businesses. Eric opened the Yahoo Music Store in the United States. The Yahoo Music Store would be open to the public on the day of the MP3 player's release. Currently, it was only in the internal testing stage. After logging into the website, Eric picked up the USB cable on the table and lowered his head to connect it to the computer's mainframe. Only then did he realize that the computer in the office didn't have a USB port. After thinking for a while, he remembered that USB data transmission was a technical standard that Intel, IBM, Microsoft, and other IT giants started to promote last year. In other words, only the latest personal computers had a USB port. Currently, other than USB, there were 2 mainstream data transmission standards that had already appeared. There was also Apple's FireWire. However, since last year, Apple's market share had begun to fall off a cliff. This year, it was expected to only account for 5% of the North American personal computer sales. Even if Steve Jobs returned to Apple a few years later, Apple was destined not to be the mainstream of personal computers. Eric didn't let the research and development department invest in this area. The computer in front of him couldn't be used for data transmission, so Eric had to give up for the time being. He planned to test it at night when he returned to his residence. His own laptop had a USB port. At this time, Peter Ritchie opened the door and came in with 2 lunches. He placed the lunches on the coffee table in the lounge area. Seeing that Eric didn't have any other orders, he nodded to Carolyn and left. Carolyn had just learned how to play songs. When she saw Peter Ritchie bringing the lunches over, she hurriedly took off her headphones. Eric brought Carolyn to the sofa and sat down. He said, "Time is tight, so I can only treat you to a simple lunch here. You don't mind, right?" "No, I won't." Carolyn shook her head and took the lunches out of the lunch bag. It was a simple lunch. There were sandwiches, barbecue, small cakes, and vegetable salad. It looked good, but in fact, only those who ate it would know. Eric didn't have the energy to complain about British food. He just wanted to fill his stomach. The crew only had an hour for lunch break, so he was too lazy to give himself special treatment. Looking at Carolyn's habitual appearance, it was obvious that girls should eat this. Sigh, how pitiful. Carolyn took out 2 glasses of apple juice and handed one to Eric. She just happened to notice Eric's expression and asked curiously, "Eric, what's wrong?" "Nothing." Eric shook his head and calmly took a bite of a cheese sandwich. Carolyn blinked her large eyes a few times and laughed softly. "Eric, do you feel that British food is bad?" Seeing that Carolyn didn't seem to mind, Eric nodded seriously. "Haha." Carolyn laughed. She wasn't angry, but she still retorted a little. We just want to be simple." From the moment he met Carolyn, Eric could feel the little pride of British in her bones. He didn't continue this topic and changed the topic. "The MP3 player has been completed. How's the progress on the e-reader?" "The main problem is the processor chip. For the past 2 years, ARM has focused on developing mobile phone chips with Texas Instruments. They don't have the spare energy to provide us with more technical support. Therefore, the R&D Center can only use the technology provided by ARM to design their own. Although it's not as complicated as the mobile phone chip, the development of the control chip for the e-reader is much more difficult than the audio decoding chip for the MP3 player." As Carolyn was speaking, Eric suddenly raised his head and interrupted her. ARM is a company in Cambridge. They mainly engage in the licensing of microprocessor core design technology," Carolyn replied. Seeing that Eric had suddenly sunk into deep thought, she asked, "Eric, is there a problem?" "Of course there was a problem, a very big problem." Eric sighed in his heart. Microsoft and Intel's domination of the personal computer market was irreversible. Other than taking the lead on the internet through Yahoo, AOL, and Cisco, Eric had also been thinking about and implementing the layout of the future smartphone and mobile internet era. Qualcomm, Nokia, Yahoo, and the investment in the mobile telecommunications company Sprint were all important chess pieces that Eric planned for 10 years from now. However, if one thought about the Wintel alliance, one would know that in order to firmly control the mobile era in the future, one would need the mobile phone operating system, and the other would need the mobile phone processor chip. In the original space-time, ARM firmly controlled more than 95% of the mobile smart terminal market. Apple, Qualcomm, Samsung, and almost all other electronic manufacturers used ARM chip technology for their chips. However, more than 10 years later, due to the widespread and even somewhat excessive licensing of ARM, as well as mainstream manufacturers such as Apple and Samsung, after the technology matured, they abandoned ARM's public architecture and began to develop their own chip schemes based on it. Although ARM controlled a large number of core patents, it was completely impossible for it to have a monopoly similar to Intel's in the PC processor industry. But now, it was just the beginning. If he could take down ARM in advance, even if other mobile chip technology standards appeared in the future, ARM had already proven the superiority of its technology in his previous life. With the support of Qualcomm, Nokia, Sprint, and other giants in the entire industrial chain in terms of distribution channels, marketing, and other aspects, ARM could once again dominate the mobile chip industry. It was even possible for ARM to reach Intel's position in the PC chip market. After thinking through all this, Eric looked up and was about to look for Peter Ritchie when he happened to meet Carolyn's puzzled gaze. After calming down a little, Eric realized that Peter Ritchie would definitely be by his side to help him with his daily affairs. Since there was a ready-made candidate in front of him, he asked, "Carolyn, how long is your leave this time?" Carolyn didn't know what was wrong with Eric, but she still replied, "Half a month." "Well, I'll give you an extension. How about a month?" "Huh?" Carolyn was even more puzzled. Eric continued, "It's like this. I just thought of something. Since you're here, there's no need to transfer someone from Los Angeles. During this time, I hope you can help me collect information on ARM. You've collected information on Qualcomm before, so you should be very familiar with it. I need everything on ARM, including information on their management, shareholders, business conditions, partners, and so on." Carolyn roughly understood Eric's intentions when she thought of Qualcomm. She said, "Eric, do you plan to buy this company?" Eric nodded and said, "When the time comes, you might have to make a trip to Cambridge. I'll get someone to specially arrange a driver for you." "No need." Carolyn hurriedly shook her head and said, "I can drive myself. I know a lot of people in Cambridge." "Then forget it. If you need any help, you can contact Peter or call me directly." As Eric spoke, he noticed that the expression on Carolyn's face was no longer as relaxed as before. He seemed to realize something and said, "Well, isn't this a bit of a disruption to your vacation? If you don't want to do it, I'll call Kelly and ask her to send someone over." No, I'm willing." Carolyn hurriedly shook her head. In fact, she was just thinking that if she could stay in the UK for a month, she would have a special job to do. Wouldn't that mean that she could find a reason to see Eric more often? Thinking of this, Carolyn felt her cheeks become a little hot. The two of them ate lunch and talked about some details. Before they left, Eric gave the pink MP3 player to Carolyn. Although Carolyn liked the player very much, she refused. "This is a sample. How can I accept it? Samples are meant for people to try." Eric smiled and stuffed the box into Carolyn's hands. He said, "I'll get someone to send you the account number of the Yahoo Music store tonight. By the way, if you want to download music, you may need the latest computer with a USB port. I can't help you with this. When you're done with the trial, you can take some time to write a trial report." "All right then." Only then did Carolyn put away the music player. An hour was actually very short. Carolyn looked at her watch. It was already 12:55 p.m., so she said goodbye and left. Eric asked Peter Ritchie to send the remaining 2 MP3 players to his residence. He also instructed Peter to help Carolyn collect information about ARM. After that, he started his afternoon work. Kate had been a little cautious ever since she joined the cast. After all, she was just a newcomer and an outsider from Australia. However, after Eric accepted her suggestion in the morning, she finally relaxed a little and began to express her own suggestions boldly. Ever since Kate joined the cast in Italy, Pierce Brosnan had been a little depressed because he often couldn't keep up with Kate's pace. However, because Eric supported him behind the scenes, and because Kate was just a Bond girl, no matter how outstanding her performance was, she couldn't affect his position in the cast too much. Therefore, Pierce Brosnan didn't show too much negative emotion. Except for the occasional conflict when he was acting with Kate, the entire shooting process went smoothly. The shooting at the underwater studio ended smoothly in the afternoon. Most of Kate's scenes with Pierce Brosnan were also completed. Kate's remaining scenes were with Christina Aguilera, who played her sister. This was a brand new side story that had nothing to do with the original film. Of course, there weren't many scenes. After all, this was a 007 movie, and James Bond would always be the core of the core. Although Eric had absolute control over the 007 series, he wouldn't make too many changes to the overall style of the James Bond series. Chapter 8-11. In September, while Eric was filming Casino Royale in the United Kingdom, the North American summer holiday officially came to an end. The 3 films released by the Firefly Group during the summer, The Matrix, Deadly Island, and Final Destination, under the New Line Entertainment label, had a total box office of $420 million. Although the 3 films were still showing sporadically in North American theaters, the hundreds of thousands of US dollars a week did not affect the total box office share much. Compared to the box office total of the previous years, which was almost double the box office total of the second place, Firefly Group's box office revenue this year not only completely lost this advantage, but even Universal Pictures with a slight advantage of $435 million snatched the summer box office title that it had firmly held for several years. While The Mummy 2 and The Fat Professor led the box office, the other 2 films released by Universal Pictures also achieved good results. After Firefly, Warner released a total of 6 films during the summer. Although there were no box office hits, they still followed closely behind Firefly with a total revenue of $380 million due to the advantage of quantity. Perhaps because of the dramatic decline in the performance of Firefly's summer movies, Universal, Warner, and then Paramount, Fox, and other major film companies, this year's summer box office revenue showed significant growth compared to previous years. When Variety magazine officially announced this year's summer box office data and related commentary articles, other media outlets immediately began to follow up. Many professional media outlets publicly stated that the decline in Firefly's film performance indicated that Hollywood would return to the normal state, where the 7 major film companies were evenly matched. This was because before the rise of Firefly, the 7 major Hollywood film companies had a fixed production scale and distribution channels. Even if one of them occasionally produced a blockbuster film, most of the time, the market share of the 7 major film companies was relatively balanced according to their own comprehensive strength. Although the 7 major Hollywood companies had developed and integrated in the direction of media groups, the film business still accounted for a considerable share. After the statement that Firefly had returned to normal was recognized by most media outlets, the capital market also reacted immediately. The stock prices of Time Warner, Viacom, MGM, and other companies rose by more than 10% in just a few days. Even Sony, whose Brave Game 2 failed miserably at the box office, saw a small rise in its stock price. However, the Firefly Group, a media company that had been speeding in recent years, suddenly slowed down. Naturally, the media was most concerned about the internal reaction of the Firefly Group. In order to get some feedback from the senior management of the Firefly Group, some of the media did not hesitate to deliberately provoke the Firefly Group. However, after dealing with the sequel of The Matrix, Firefly's public relations department had been very low-key, unless it was a counterattack to obviously false news. As for Hollywood, most people were just waiting for a good show. Especially after Titanic premiered at the Venice Film Festival, many people were looking forward to the end of the year. With a production cost of US $215 million, a distribution cost of US $50 million, and a length of more than 3 hours, Hollywood could not see the possibility of Titanic being a box office success. While most of Hollywood's Firefly competitors were just waiting to watch the show, Wall Street's eyes were already shining. Once Titanic suffered a huge loss, not only would it swallow the profits of Firefly's other blockbuster films, but it might also have an impact on Firefly's closed production system, making it conform to the industry rules and no longer adhere to the self-sufficient production model. As long as Firefly opened a gap and financed its film production in the capital market like other film companies, then Wall Street had enough confidence to tear this gap step by step and eventually swallow Firefly, making it, like most film companies in Hollywood, shrouded in the control of capital. Under the watchful eyes of the outside world, Firefly Group's internal affairs were proceeding step by step. On September 15th, after more than half a year of preparation, the FFM TV station that Firefly, Fox, and MGM cooperated with was officially launched. Because FFM TV station had more high-quality film content than the previous TV station, and implemented a series of promotional activities, the original subscribers of several pay cable channels were basically retained, and the total number of subscribers reached 1 million. Because FFM TV station's positioning was completely similar to HBO, with FFM TV station's launch, Time Warner naturally faced a formidable enemy. Warner Cable did not hesitate to tear up the contract, and the first thing they did was to completely cut off the signal of the original FFM TV station's 300,000 subscribers. The entire Time Warner was also in a state of complete ban on FFM TV station. Although Firefly Group and Time Warner would not publicly fall out over this matter, there were not many scruples between subsidiaries. The moment Warner Cable cut off the user's signal, FFM TV station filed a lawsuit in federal court against Warner Cable for using their market position to engage in unfair competition. Warner Cable knew that this lawsuit would only increase FFM's reputation, but they had no choice but to respond, because FFM TV station obviously would not agree to a private settlement. As a veteran of Hugh Lewin's operation, Wayne Stan quickly hyped up this matter, and FFM TV station became famous in a short time. At the same time as FFM TV station's launch, September was also the beginning of the fall TV season. ABC TV's Friends, Emergency Room Story, Survivor, as well as Lifetime TV's City on the Hill, Project Runway, America's Top Model, and other popular series all returned in September. When a person was busy, the days would always fly by. When Firefly TV sent the September TV ratings report to Eric, it was already October. The weather in London was even colder, and the filming of Casino Royale was more than 80% complete. There was only 1 month left, and the most important scene would be the rescue of Angela Rhind by Bond and the Thunderbolt Girls trio. Kate, Charles, and Penelope still needed a week to join the cast. In the past few days, the crew's filming was relatively easy, mainly the dialogue scenes of Bond, Mrs. M, Vesper, and a few villains. In the morning, after filming an interaction scene between Vesper and Angela, Eric sat in the cafeteria of Pine Forest Film Studio. After lunch, he still had some time left, so he read the TV ratings report that had just been sent from New York. On ABC TV, Friends, Emergency Room Story, and Survivor were still the top 3 shows in terms of ratings. This year, Friends was in its 8th season, and the series was scheduled to end in its 10th season. ABC had already announced the news before the start of this season. Although the 6 main leads were younger than in Zhang Ye's previous life, they were tired of filming for a series for 10 years and were not willing to continue filming. In this time and space, Jennifer Aniston did not join forces with the other main actors to stage a $1 million drama. However, Firefly was not stingy either. For the last 3 seasons of the contract, the 6 main actors' pay was raised to $600,000 per episode, which was double their pay for the first 2 seasons. As the most popular medical drama in recent years, Emergency Room Story had very stable ratings, and the average viewership for a single episode was above 20 million. After the peak viewership of the first 2 seasons, Survivor averaged 30 million viewers, and with other reality shows launched by other TV stations competing for viewers, the ratings started to drop. However, because the production cost of Survivor was very low, even if the viewership dropped below 10 million, the TV station still made a lot of money. Moreover, the first 3 episodes of this season averaged 17 million viewers, which was far from a failure. It was one of the best reality shows in North America. Other than the three leading shows, ABC TV also had a new dark horse in terms of ratings: the sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond. This sitcom focused on family warmth, and under the guidance of Friends, the first episode reached 15 million viewers. Maybe because of the family theme, or because of the cultural differences between the East and the West, this sitcom was not very popular in Asia in his previous life. However, at its peak, its viewership was definitely not much worse than Friends. 15 million viewers was definitely just the beginning. It was estimated that when Friends officially ended, Everybody Loves Raymond would also reach its peak viewership, and it would be the perfect replacement for Friends. In his memory, Everybody Loves Raymond was CBS's ace sitcom. However, Eric did not get involved in this project. He only found out after seeing the list of new shows submitted by ABC in May. The reason Everybody Loves Raymond was transferred to ABC was mainly because the producer of Everybody Loves Raymond was David Letterman. ABC had reformed late-night shows 2 years ago, and they poached The Late Show with David Letterman from CBS to ABC. David Letterman's project as the producer was naturally taken over by ABC. After looking at ABC's viewership statistics, Eric was about to look at Lifetime's data when Christina Aguilera walked over with a small tray. The girl stood across from Eric and asked obediently, "Eric, can I sit here?" Eric smiled as he tidied up the documents in front of him and nodded at the girl. Christina happily put down the tray and sat across from him. Although the two of them had sex, Christina didn't cling on to him at all. She didn't tell anyone about their relationship either. Eric was very satisfied with her smart and tactful behavior. Christina's scenes that day were all related to her. Therefore, when Christina took the initiative to sit next to Eric, everyone would only think that she wanted to talk to the director about the movie. It wouldn't attract much attention. Christina picked up the utensils and took small bites of the vegetable salad on her plate. Eric smiled and asked, "What were you doing just now? Why are you only here now?" Christina answered obediently, "Mom called from Los Angeles, so we chatted for a while." "Oh, are you homesick?" "Not really." Christina shook her head. She was indeed not homesick. As a child from a single-parent family, Christina was much more independent than Brittany. She did not have the intention to go to school. She had a job and could travel around the world with the crew, so she enjoyed it. Eric smiled and was about to turn his gaze back to the documents in his hands when Christina said, "Eric, I suddenly feel that Angela's character isn't very cool." Eric looked up and asked, "Then what do you think is cool?" Christina had, of course, watched Charlie's Angels before, so she said without thinking, "Of course, it's like Kate Beckinsale's character, Selena. But Angela is more like a bookworm who likes to tinker with machines. I think that if Charlie's detective agency really exists, they definitely won't like Angela Lynn." In the script of Casino Royale, Christina's character was set to be a technological geek who was obsessed with precision machines. She was influenced by her father when she was young. You might think that Angela Lynn isn't cool because Casino Royale is a James Bond movie. The movie doesn't give the character much room to express herself. However, this character has a very perfect setting. She's equivalent to Dr. Q in the James Bond series. In the future, she'll provide all kinds of cool high-tech props for Charlie's Angels. Well, after the movie is released next year, Marvel Entertainment will publish a comic related to Angela Lynn. You'll be able to see it then. Eric had only given her the role back then and did not reveal too much about it. Christina had once thought that the role might just be an ordinary character in the Casino Royale series. Christina's eyes sparkled when she heard Eric's words. She asked, "Then, Eric, does this mean that I can appear in the movie in the future?" Eric smiled and said, "Your character will definitely appear in the comic. Marvel has already started to do this. As for whether you can appear in the MGM movie universe again, it involves too many issues. Your future career development, the audience's feedback on your character's image, the needs of the story, and so on. I can't promise you anything now." Christina was not disappointed at all despite Eric's words. The girl's naturally charming eyes looked around and she lowered her voice and said, Eric, can I go to your place tonight? Why? Are you trying to bribe me? Eric said with a smile. Hee hee, this is just an actress trying to please Mr. Director. Forget it. You still have scenes tomorrow. I don't want my actress to be unable to get out of bed tomorrow. Chapter 8:12. Cambridge City was located approximately 70 kilometers northeast of London. On October 5th, Saturday, Eric brought Carolyn to Cambridge early in the morning. In order to avoid being followed by the paparazzi surrounding the Pine Forest Film Studio, they took a helicopter. Carolyn had spent a month collecting a large amount of information regarding ARM. She had also contacted the CEO of ARM, Roger Wilson. Aware of Eric's interest in ARM, the other party was also very enthusiastic. Both parties had agreed to meet today to get in touch with each other. Although they were both surnamed Wilson, Roger Wilson had no relationship with Carolyn's family. Just like Barbara Broccoli's half-brother, Michael Wilson, Wilson was a very common British surname. Eric was still discussing this issue with Carolyn on the helicopter. Carolyn had only said that her family was the Wilson family of Berkshire. Although the girl didn't have any arrogance when she spoke, her tone was matter-of-fact. It gave Eric the same feeling as when the descendants of Zhao Song in ancient times had said that they were the Zhao family of Hejian. Cambridge City had a long history, and there weren't any tall buildings. Instead, it was filled with simple houses that seemed to be at least a few hundred years old. If it weren't for the modern cars on both sides of the road that spoiled the atmosphere, it would definitely be more enjoyable to wander around this historical town. The appointment with Roger Wilson was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so Eric and Carolyn wandered around Cambridge in the morning. Originally, they had wanted to steal half a day of leisure. However, it was a pity that when Eric and Carolyn walked together, they were too eye-catching. This wasn't because of their handsome looks, but the difference in height was too great. Although Carolyn was wearing high-heeled boots, her height still only reached Eric's shoulder. Today, they were both wearing black trench coats. Although Carolyn's trench coat was definitely a lot smaller than Eric's, it still looked somewhat like a couple's outfit. Finally, they passed by a women's clothing store. Eric came up with a plan and brought the girl inside. When they came out, Eric was still in his usual attire. However, Carolyn had changed into a pink hoodie and the same pair of light-colored casual pants. The only difference was that her high-heeled boots had been replaced by a pair of white flats. Eric threw the clothes Carolyn had just changed out of to a follower not far behind him. Sizing up the somewhat uncomfortable expression on the girl's face, he smiled and said, "Now you're a little more pleasing to the eye." Noticing the mischievous smile on Eric's face, Carolyn bashfully said, "Eric, you must be up to no good again." Eric shook his head and said, "No, we won't attract attention like this. Everyone will just think that you're my sister or something." Feeling vexed, Carolyn wrinkled her nose and said, "I don't want to be your sister." Eric said casually, "Then cousin it is." After Carolyn confirmed that Eric was just joking, she didn't refute. However, her little mind couldn't help but wander around the UK's laws and genetics. They continued to stroll through the narrow alleys of Cambridge. When they passed by a boutique, Eric saw a light grey deerstalker hat in the store. He bought one and put it on. At the same time, he also put away his glasses. Seeing Eric fiddling with the hat with interest, Carolyn clumsily teased him. "You don't look like Sherlock Holmes at all." Eric pulled the hat down and smiled. "Is it because I'm too handsome?" Carolyn smiled and said, "No, it's because in the original novel, Sherlock Holmes was a middle-aged man. He even had a beard." Eric said, "Who knows, maybe I can invest in a younger version of Sherlock Holmes in the future. The setting will be set in modern times. Charlotte and Watson will have to follow the trend and have an unforgettable scene." Carolyn imagined the scene of Eric destroying a classic and laughed. "Haha, that will definitely be messy." Eric also laughed and said, "Maybe everyone will like it." The University of Cambridge had more than 30 colleges and research institutions scattered in the southwest of Cambridge. Carolyn took Eric to visit a few of the more well-known colleges and the dormitory where she used to live with Rachel. At 11 o'clock in the morning, under Carolyn's recommendation, the two had lunch at a pizza restaurant. After that, they strolled to a small park opposite Queen's College, Cambridge. It wasn't too far away from the coffee shop that they had agreed to meet with Roger Wilson. Between the small park and Queen's College was the famous Cam River, which was transliterated as the Kong River. There were many bridges on the river. It was already past noon, and Eric didn't intend to continue strolling. He asked the accompanying bodyguard for information on ARM and sat down on a bench in the small park facing the Cam River. He knocked on the seat beside him, and Carolyn also sat down. The autumn sun was always a bit cold and pale, which made it easy for people to feel touched. Fortunately, it was noon, and the sun's rays would always bring some warmth to the body. Eric crossed his legs and placed the information on his knees. He sniffed the light fragrance coming from Carolyn's body and casually flipped through the information in his hands. He had already read it several times before, and some of the important information was also memorized in his mind. Speaking of which, the reason for the emergence of the ARM processor was very interesting. One word: poverty. In the early 1980s, with the rise of personal computers, the British BBC television made a documentary about the microprocessor, which aroused a strong response from the audience. The BBC then decided to cooperate with Acorn Computer, which could be said to be the parent company of ARM, to launch a cheap PC to sell to interested audiences. Acorn was very poor. Unlike IBM, Intel, and other IT industry giants in the United States, Acorn didn't have enough financial resources to develop a high-performance processor with the core of the complex instruction set, CISC. They could only develop low-cost, low-power processors based on the reduced instruction set, RISC, which required relatively fewer transistors. However, due to the overall trend of the PC industry to pursue more powerful processors, Acorn quickly declined after a short period of success due to its low price factor. In 1990, Apple Computer noticed the advantages of ARM technology and cooperated with some of the original Acorn engineers to establish the ARM company to develop processor chips for Apple's Newton tablet. Although the Newton tablet had a very advanced design concept, its practicality was very low, and the price was very high. After a few generations of products, it was currently on the verge of production. Because of the failure of the Newton tablet, ARM experienced a few years of low tide. In the last 2 years, because of the rise of digital mobile phones, ARM once again found a direction for development. Currently, ARM was closely cooperating with Texas Instruments to develop mobile phone chips based on ARM technology. Coincidentally, this chip was developed by Nokia under the entrustment of Texas Instruments. Although Nokia had a strong advantage in digital communication technology, the development of its own chips had just begun. Before this, it used processors from chip manufacturers such as Texas Instruments. At present, because the first ARM mobile phone chip hadn't been officially launched, ARM didn't attract much attention from the industry. ARM also wasn't listed. The equity structure was relatively simple, mainly in the hands of Apple and ARM's parent company. Buying ARM would only cost about $80 million. The licensing of ARM technology wasn't as widespread as in his previous life. Currently, there were only a few companies such as Apple Computer and Texas Instruments. After buying ARM, it would be easy to control the further spread of ARM technology. However, the layout of ARM technology needed to be carefully considered. Chapter 8:13. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Eric and Carolyn arrived at the agreed coffee shop on time. Roger Wilson was already waiting there. Roger Wilson was around 40 years old. He was tall and wore a light gray suit. He wore rimless glasses and his hair was meticulously combed. He didn't look like a technical engineer at all. After a polite introduction, they found their seats and sat down. After ordering coffee and waiting for the waiter to leave, Roger Wilson looked at Eric and said, "Mr. Williams, is the filming of 007 going well? Everyone is looking forward to it." Eric nodded and said, "Of course, everything is going well. Also, Roger, you can call me Eric." "Okay, Eric." Roger Wilson smiled and nodded. "Actually, when we found out that you were interested in ARM, we were very surprised." Eric smiled. After all, Roger was still an engineer who focused on technology. He took the initiative to talk about the main topic so quickly. The waiter brought the coffee over. Eric paused for a moment and waited for the waiter to leave. Then he said, "I have always been very interested in the IT field. Moreover, in my opinion, ARM technology has a very wide range of application prospects. That's why I asked Carolyn to collect information about ARM technology." Roger Wilson thought for a moment and said, "Eric, can I know your specific expectations for ARM technology?" "Of course." Eric nodded and looked at Carolyn. The girl took out a Newton tablet from her bag and placed it on the table. Eric opened the tablet and said, "I hope to buy ARM and continue to focus on the development of application software chips." If he wanted to buy ARM, he needed a reasonable reason. Otherwise, the technical team of ARM would not follow a boss who had no purpose. Eric's purpose for buying ARM was very simple. He wanted to prevent ARM technology from spreading on a large scale, and even cut off the licensing of technology to possible competitors. However, this reason, which was full of monopoly, was not enough to let outsiders know. As for the research and development of mobile phone chips, Eric already had Nokia and Qualcomm. As long as these two companies obtained the complete licensing of ARM technology, their research and development of mobile phone chips would definitely far exceed that of ARM itself. After careful consideration, Eric set his sights on the tablet. Roger Wilson took the Newton tablet from Eric and operated it a few times. His expression was a little gloomy as he said, "Eric, I spoke to the CEO of Apple, Mr. John Sculley. They might stop the production of the Newton tablet next year. So this product should be considered a failure." Roger Wilson's subtext was obviously saying that Eric's choice to develop a tablet PDA was not a wise move. However, Eric disagreed with Roger Wilson's point of view. He said, "Roger, Newton is a very good product. It failed because it didn't find a suitable price and market position." According to the information I've collected, the total number of PDA units shipped last year reached 3 million units. In the first half of this year, the number has already reached 2.6 million. It can be said that this is a rapidly growing market. Roger Wilson quickly calculated. If what Eric said was correct, then according to the average price of $500, the tablet PDA market would reach $2.5 billion this year. Although this number was insignificant compared to the $100 billion PDA market, it was enough to prove the value of the tablet PDA. The original intention of ARM was to develop processors for Apple's Newton tablet. Roger Wilson and most of the engineers at ARM were very attached to the tablet PDA. After thinking about it, Roger Wilson said, "Then, Eric, what kind of tablet PDA do you want to build?" Eric said, "I plan to build this tablet PDA into a peripheral hardware product for Yahoo. If we can cooperate, ARM will be responsible for the development of the chip, and Yahoo will develop a special operating system for the tablet PDA. Yahoo's browser, instant messaging, email, and other services will be integrated into the tablet PDA. I want this product to focus more on entertainment and practicality. Not only can it connect to the internet, but it can also read books, listen to music, and so on." "According to what you said, this is actually a mini handheld PC terminal," Roger Wilson said. "However, Eric, have you thought about how to connect to the internet? The biggest advantage of a tablet PDA is its mobility. You can use it anywhere, but if you have to drag a long cable around to use the internet, I think most people will think that it is more convenient to use a laptop. This is easy to solve." Eric smiled and said, "At the beginning of this year, I happened to let Firefly Electronics buy a complete patent for a wireless LAN technology called Wi-Fi. This technology can connect terminal equipment to the internet within a short distance. Although the transmission distance is only a few dozen meters, it is enough to meet the requirements of a person to use the internet at home or in the company area. This seems to be very similar to the Bluetooth technology introduced by Ericsson," Roger Wilson said. "However, Eric, we may be able to integrate the Wi-Fi technology into the tablet PDA, but where will the signal emitter come from?" The wireless router integrated with Wi-Fi technology would only become popular 10 years later. Although Firefly controlled a large amount of shares in Cisco, Cisco's main business area was the enterprise router market. It did not involve a large range of personal consumer terminals. Eric would not deliberately interfere with Cisco's business thinking. Since Cisco could not provide any help in this regard, Eric could not rely on Firefly's power to promote other router companies to develop wireless routers. However, this problem was not difficult to solve. Eric said, as long as a person's home is connected to the internet, then it is very easy to create a signal emitter, or you can call it a hotspot. We only need to equip this tablet PDA with a Wi-Fi technology chip and a signal emitter. Compared to the price of a tablet PDA that is easily hundreds of dollars, this mini Wi-Fi signal emitter may only cost $10 to make. Therefore, just like the charger of a tablet PDA, it will not cause too much of a burden on the overall cost and price. It is very feasible. Chapter 8:14. No company was willing to just be a technology licensing manufacturer. Eric and Roger Wilson talked for the whole afternoon and basically confirmed their intention to acquire ARM. Next, Firefly only needed to persuade a few of ARM's major shareholders to transfer their shares. ARM's market value was about $80 million, and it didn't show any amazing growth potential. As long as Eric offered a reasonable price, it wouldn't be difficult to buy this company. The autumn sky in London was very short. When the helicopter landed on a helipad in Pinewood Studio, it was already dusk. Eric got off the helicopter first. Looking at Carolyn carefully stepping on the pedals, he smiled and reached out his hand. "Come, I'll carry you down." Carolyn didn't mind letting Eric carry her down, but the smile on his face and the tone of his voice made it seem like he was talking to a child. Carolyn hated it when others treated her like a little girl. After all, she was only 1 year younger than Eric. She was 25 this year. "No, I can do it myself," Carolyn said as she jumped down. Her body was a little shaky, but she was immediately supported by Eric. When Carolyn steadied herself, Eric said, "Let's go have dinner together. The restaurant here is quite good. I'll send you back later." During the day, Carolyn had driven over by herself. However, it was already dark. Although Wilson Manor wasn't far from here, Eric didn't feel at ease letting Carolyn go back alone. They were already in the outskirts of London, and both sides of the road were basically wilderness and farmland. Driving alone at night would definitely be a terrifying thing. Carolyn walked out side by side with Eric and said, "Eric, I can drive myself back. Besides, I promised my mother that I would go home for dinner." "Then forget about dinner together. I'll send you back first," Eric said. Seeing that the girl was about to say something, he continued, "Don't refuse. I don't feel comfortable letting you drive home alone. Tomorrow, I'll get someone to send your car to Wilson Manor." Carolyn lowered her head slightly and said softly, "Then, okay." When they walked out of the tarmac, the chauffeur had already prepared the car for them. Eric politely opened the car door for Carolyn before getting in as well. Eric didn't think too much about it. He just felt that it would be more polite for him to personally send Carolyn home. After all, it wasn't too far away. However, Carolyn, who was seated beside Eric, was at a loss as to what to do. Her little brain started to buzz unconsciously. Eric was going to her house. There seemed to be something wrong with this. How should he entertain him later? What would Mom and Dad think about this? Eric casually chatted with Carolyn for a while. Seeing that the girl was somewhat absent-minded, he quieted down. The chauffeur was clearly much faster than Carolyn. 15 minutes later, the car passed by a stone bridge. Eric took advantage of the streetlights on the bridge to look out. Outside the car window was a deep river about 10 meters wide. This must be the Tame River that Carolyn had mentioned. The Wilson Manor was on the other side of the Tame River. After passing through the stone bridge, the car stopped outside a manor in the blink of an eye. Eric and Carolyn got out of the car together and looked over curiously. Their gazes passed through the iron fence, and under the lights of the manor, they could see the wide and flat lawn and the castle in the distance. Due to the long history of aristocracy, there were countless castle buildings in Britain. However, due to the expensive maintenance and repair costs, most of them had been abandoned. Even the Windsor Castle of the British royal family required state funds to maintain it. In this era, the aristocrats who were able to maintain the castles and manors left behind by their ancestors had very deep backgrounds. Carolyn stood beside Eric, but she was clearly at a loss. She wanted to invite Eric in, but she didn't know if Eric would be willing. She also didn't know what her parents were thinking. After all, she had never told her parents that Eric would be visiting. At this time, the manor's guards saw their young miss and a man get out of the car together. They took the initiative to welcome them. After approaching, they recognized Eric's appearance. Seeing someone walk over, Carolyn came back to her senses and took the initiative to introduce them. "Eric, this is Mark." Eric politely extended his hand to shake the man's hand and said, "Hello, I'm Eric Williams." "Hello, Mr. Williams." The guard shook hands with Eric in a reserved manner and looked at Carolyn. "Miss, do you need me to inform Master and Madam?" This." Carolyn looked at Eric. "No need to trouble yourself. It's just that it's a little late, so I just sent Carolyn back." Eric shook his head and said to Mark. He then turned to Carolyn. "I'll go back first. Send my regards to your parents." "Okay." Carolyn nodded. She didn't know if she was disappointed or regretful in her heart. The driver passed 2 bags over. Eric remembered that these were the windbreaker and shoes that Carolyn had changed out of during the day. He took them and passed them to Mark, who was standing beside Carolyn, before saying to the girl, "Then, I'll go first. Goodbye." "Goodbye." Carolyn waved her hand at Eric. Seeing the car's lights disappear into the distance, she retracted her gaze and took her clothes from Mark. "Mark, I'll do it myself." Mark didn't understand the current situation at all. It was only when his young miss walked into the manor alone with the 2 bags that he reacted and called the Count and his wife. When the Count's wife, Edith Wilson, heard the guard's announcement, she came out to welcome them. Seeing her daughter wearing a pink hoodie and flat boots, she looked like a little girl. She was completely different from the clothes she had worn during the day. Her eyes flashed, but she quickly regained her calm. She took the bags and handed them to the maid behind her. Holding her daughter's hand, she didn't mention anything about Eric and gently asked, "Darling, how was your day?" "Yes, Mother." Carolyn nodded and said, "Eric personally sent me back. It's a pity that he wasn't willing to stay as a guest." The Count's wife looked at Carolyn's doubtful and disappointed expression and said with a smile, "Mr. Williams is a gentleman. Perhaps he didn't want to be too rude." As she said this, the Count's wife sighed in her heart. Ever since she was young, the Count and his wife had doted on their youngest daughter the most. Even Carolyn's 3 older brothers were very protective of their youngest sister. They had originally hoped that Carolyn would be like many other aristocratic young ladies, finding a husband of equal status and living a peaceful and happy life. However, it was a pity that when Carolyn graduated from Cambridge University a few years ago, the Count had arranged for his daughter to go on blind dates. Carolyn, who had always been well-behaved and obedient since she was young, had unexpectedly displayed an intense resistance, and had even tried to run away from home. After that, Carolyn unintentionally met Eric Williams. The Count and his wife both felt that if the 2 of them could walk together, it would be a pretty good choice. However, things didn't develop as they wished. After that, Carolyn boldly expressed to the Count and his wife that she didn't want to continue with her previous life. As a result, she ran off to Harvard University to study business school. In the end, she ended up working for Eric Williams due to a freak combination of factors. Over the years, as Eric's reputation grew, the Count and his wife also learned more about Eric's past deeds. They realized that it would be very difficult for Eric and Carolyn to walk together. Therefore, when Eric was filming Casino Royale at Pine Forest Film Studio, which wasn't far from Wilson Manor, they didn't send any more invitations to him. However, looking at her daughter with some pity, the Count's wife suddenly thought of something that happened many years ago. Although everyone around her said that Carolyn had a weak temperament, no one knew a daughter better than her mother. Under Carolyn's weak appearance, there was a certain stubborn character that was exactly the same as a certain woman from many years ago. It was precisely because they were worried that Carolyn would repeat the mistakes of those years that the Count and his wife allowed their daughter to live according to her own wishes. In the end, she was still their precious darling whom they had cherished and cared for many years. Although the traditions and glory of the aristocracy were important, they were not as important as their daughter. The Count and his wife had 3 outstanding sons, and they didn't expect Carolyn to inherit the family business. As long as their daughter could be happy, it was fine. Noticing that her mother's expression was somewhat absent-minded, Carolyn asked, "Mother, what are you thinking about?" The Count's wife shook her head. "It's nothing. Your father is waiting for us to have dinner together. Quickly go in." After returning to Pine Forest Film Studio and having a simple dinner, Eric went to the study of his residence. These days, apart from filming, he had been thinking about the future of the mobile internet and smartphone era. Today, he had confirmed his intention to acquire ARM, which also meant that he was about to grasp another important chess piece in his hands. However, there was still a long way to go in the future. Nokia, Qualcomm, and other companies that Firefly Investments had invested in had been developing rapidly in accordance with the trajectory set by the management. Because he had absolute control of Nokia, Eric had absolute power to make the mobile phone industry giant develop according to his own ideas. It was the same for Qualcomm, which had a high proportion of shares, and Yahoo, which was in a rising state. However, if this was the case, Eric would have to devote a lot of energy to control these companies. This was obviously not possible because Firefly Group already occupied most of his time and energy. If he was distracted to manage the industries under Firefly Investments, he would be exhausted in the future. Eric couldn't think of a second result. Therefore, he could only grasp a general direction and leave the specific matters to the professional managers of these companies. According to the current trend, Nokia would only go on the trajectory of the original world. This development idea was very feasible before the rise of smartphones, but once smartphones rose, Nokia would inevitably decline. After these days of thinking, Eric also roughly figured out another way. In the study, Eric connected to the internet and opened the YCR chat software on the desktop. Chris in New York, Ian Neer, CEO of Yahoo, and Steve Mitnick in Boston were all online. He created a separate temporary chat room and pulled them in. Eric briefed them on the results of the meeting with Roger Wilson today. Then, the 4 of them began to discuss the topic that had been going on for the past few days. Eric's alternative plan was mainly divided into 3 stages. The plan was mainly made up of Yahoo and Firefly Electronics, spanning a span of 10 years. With the help of Yahoo, Firefly Electronics would focus on the research, development, and sales of 3 products in the next 10 years. In 1996 and 2000, Firefly's main energy would be focused on the promotion of MP3 players. At the same time, they would privately develop the tablet computer that Eric discussed with Roger Wilson in the afternoon. These few days, the few of them had a name for the tablet computer. It was called the Yahoo Pad. In the plan, ARM, Yahoo, and Firefly Electronics would all be important parts of the Yahoo Pad research and development system. For the next 4 years, ARM would focus on the development of the Yahoo Pad application chip, Yahoo would be responsible for the research and development of the Yahoo Pad system, and Firefly Electronics would be responsible for the overall structure of the product. Steve Mitnick had the idea of developing a new PC operating system a few years ago. However, at that time, the Windows operating system had already emerged, and it was impossible to break Microsoft's monopoly in the PC field. Therefore, Eric rejected Steve Mitnick's idea. However, now, Steve Mitnick's original idea could be used in the development of a mobile operating system. Eric had also provided Steve Mitnick with a lot of ideas based on his impression of Android and Apple operating systems in his previous life. In the future, this mobile operating system would also carry Eric's ambitions in the mobile internet field. This time, Eric would definitely not allow the mobile operating system industry to be divided equally between Android and Apple like in his previous life. With 4 years of research and development time, the Yahoo Pad would be officially launched in 2000. At that time, the mobile communication market would completely shift to the civilian market. Then, from 2000 to 2005, while promoting and selling the MP3 player and Yahoo Pad, Firefly Electronics would also use the technology accumulated over the past few years to quickly specialize in the development of smartphones with the help of Qualcomm and Nokia. At the same time, because of the investment in Sprint, the promotion of this phone in the mobile communication market would not be a problem. 10 years later, in 2005, Firefly Electronics would officially start the smartphone era. The advantage of this plan was that Eric did not have to disrupt the development of Nokia, Qualcomm, Yahoo, and other companies. These companies could continue to rise along the same path as before. However, at the same time, Firefly Electronics, an important chess piece that was completely outside the chessboard, could also unknowingly complete Eric's important layout for the mobile internet era 10 years later. When the time came, and Firefly Electronics products showed the corresponding potential, Eric could license the corresponding technology to Nokia and other companies at any time, so that they could smoothly complete the transition from the era of functional computers to the era of smartphones. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.